Doesn't want to spend time.
So you guys not see each other?
No.
I hope your wedding is soon.
So you're gonna see the
Because you said you wanted to do a joint earlier, and you said you were
an uncertain future. It's a region that has generally been too focused on its past, whether with the glories of the Islamic Golden Era, the Persian apogee, the Ottoman splendor, or the reclaiming of biblical Davidian past. But it's hard to move forward while looking backward. The region is also overwhelmed with the crises of the present: failed states, civil wars, proxy wars, armed non-state actors, and the like. Decision-making, both inside the region and toward the region, is continuously obsessed with the crisis of the day. And as we saw just a few days ago, everybody's thinking about that. But that leaves no bandwidth to contemplate or plan or prepare for the future. The field of future studies is not about the impossible task of predicting the future, but rather about examining key drivers and dynamics that will likely be at play in the future, thinking creatively and rigorously about what various scenarios and outcomes might look like, and helping decision makers chart a course that steers clear of the worst scenarios and favors the more positive ones. And the region is not starting from a stable or a strong position. And as it grapples in the decade ahead with the stresses of climate change, of urbanization, demographic growth, and sluggish economies, the challenges will be as serious as they are urgent. The 14th century Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, in his masterwork Al-Muqaddimah, the Introduction to History, and before presenting his own views of the future, says the following: "In the towns, we find a group of people who try to make a living out of predicting the future. All day, people come to ask them to foretell the future, how it will affect their business, their friendship, their enmities, or how long certain dynasties are going to last. Some make predictions by writing on sand. Others cast pebbles and grains of wheat, and others still look into mirrors and into water. These things are very common, and their reprehensible character is well established by the religious law. We have brought together today, we hope, a more professional and definitely not reprehensible group of experts and scholars to explore various elements of the Arab future. I want to thank all our wonderful panelists for agreeing to share their views and insights. Many thanks to our two moderators, Steve Kenny and Patrick Tucker, for agreeing to help us manage these rich and complex panels. I want to thank His Excellency Minister Al-Zayudi, who will join us shortly. He's the Minister of Climate Change and the Environment for the United Arab Emirates. He will speak in a keynote later today to share his ministry's and his country's plans and work in the area of climate change, the environment, and planning for the future. It's now my pleasure to introduce MEI Chairman Dick Clark, who I know is known to all of you. Dick has held key security positions in 4 U.S. administrations, including Special Assistant to the President for Global Affairs, Senior Director for Transnational Threats, National Coordinator for Counterterrorism, and Special Advisor to the President for Cybersecurity. And in those positions, he was always focused and often worried about the future. What was coming down the road? What was coming next? What don't we see? And in his post-government career, he has kept his attention firmly focused forward, examining and publishing about fast-moving developments in cyber, in artificial intelligence, in drone and other technologies. He currently hosts a fascinating podcast called Future State, which I would advise you to download and listen to regularly. He recently published an important book called Cassandras, which examines the cases of insightful individuals who foresaw some of the major events of the recent past that the rest of us thought were a complete surprise or were black swans. I can think of no better person to get us started in our thoughts and discussions today then Dick Clark. Dick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you all for coming to what I think, Paul, is our first conference in the new conference facility. So after being around for 70 plus years, MEI now has a new conference facility, and we're going to have 70 more years of conferences. This is the first. So welcome. The future has arrived. It's just not evenly distributed. That great line is attributed to William Gibson, the author of Neuromancer, the man who invented the word cyberspace. I know I get a lot of credit for inventing the word cyberspace, or at least forcing the US government to use it. Usually the commentary about that is a little derisive because people don't like the word cyber or cyberspace. But it was not me, it was William Gibson who invented cyberspace and who told us that the future has arrived. It's just not evenly distributed. Let's take a look at 10 proofs that the future has arrived, the future that will eventually be widely distributed. 10 things that have already begun in the last 3 to 5 years, and each of which will contribute mightily to changing the world that we will live in for the next 50 years, and the Middle East as well. So let's go through a list of David Letterman's top 10 new technologies. And the first has to be machine learning and artificial intelligence. This is not something that is going to come in the future. This is something that you're using every day, whether you know it or not. If you are using a credit card anywhere, there's machine learning and artificial intelligence in the background, trying to determine whether or not you're committing fraud, trying to determine whether or not it's actually you that's using the credit card. Artificial intelligence and machine learning will radically change every field of activity. The speed at which things happen, the accuracy with which things happen, our ability to understand what's going on will advance immeasurably with new neural networks, artificial neural networks, and machine learning. Now, it's only just begun. Number 2, robotics. If you are thinking of robotics as assembly plants, where workers have been or will be displaced by robots, that's certainly part of robotics. If you have been to a new plant, I was at a plant for Boeing a few months ago, giant Boeing plant where they were building huge aircraft, and there was almost no one there. So much of it was being done by robots. But it's not confined to factories. It's not going to be confined to assembly lines. Go online to Boston Robotics and take a look at the amazing videos of the robot creatures that have been already created by Boston Robotics. Things that can walk, jump, swim. They're here. They're already being developed. They're just not evenly distributed. Number 3, the whole area of biogenetics and bioengineering. With the advent of the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technique, it's now possible for us to change genes, to remove things like Tay-Sachs disease, like diabetes, from someone's genetic structure. That technology exists. Trials on humans have begun, and it's going to enormously change the way we do medicine. Understanding how each cancer, each individual's cancer, is unique, and coming up with medicines and therapies designed not for that kind of cancer, but for that specific cancer in a specific individual. And we will face the challenge in the next few years of deciding whether we're just going to use CRISPR-Cas9 and gene editing technology to fix defects in humans, or whether we are going to use it to enhance human capability. That will be one of the biggest decisions made in the next 10 to 20 years. The fourth the one that we talk so much about, driverless and pilotless vehicles. Driverless cars are coming, not as fast as everybody thought, by the way, but they are coming. Driverless trucks are coming. Driverless helicopters are coming. If you read The Economist last week, there was a wonderful article about how there are 200 companies today that have money and that are producing prototypes, some of which are going into service in places like Dubai first, pilotless helicopters as taxis. I know that sounds like the movie that you saw 20 years ago, but people, venture capitalists, private equity people, are investing money today to build helicopters, mini helicopters that will fly around our cities in the next couple of years in some countries. Pilotless boats are being built by the Navy. Pilotless trucks are being tested in California. Pilotless cars, driverless cars, will soon appear on our highways. Number 5, quantum computing. I just published a book this summer called The Fifth Domain, which is about the future of cyberspace. And the hardest chapter I had to write in that book was about quantum computing. It made my head explode to try to understand quantum computing. But I found a quote from Niels Bohr, one of the great physicists, who said, "If you think you understand quantum computing, you don't." How much then can we say about what the future of quantum computing is going to be? There are already quantum computers operating at Google, at Microsoft, at IBM, and at startups like Rigetti Computing in Berkeley. They, within the next year or 2 or 3, will crack all mathematical problems we have never been able to crack. They will break encryption. They will break all previous encryptions that we've used. And they will allow us to simulate worlds and simulate drug trials, simulate metallurgical developments. One scientist that we talked to for the book said, "Quantum computing will change the world as much as the transistor did." And that in the next 2 or 3 years. Number 6, changes in energy, solar power, wind power, and most importantly, battery power. Batteries to use that alternative energy. Great progress being made in all of those fronts. And cities, states, even countries are now picking years in the future, in the relatively near future, as their targets for when they will achieve alternative energy for 100%, for 50% of their energy needs. Number 7, facial recognition technology and surveillance technology. Already in the United States, CPB and some airlines are experimenting with facial recognition instead of boarding passes for airlines. Facial recognition instead of your driver's license at the TSA or at the immigration booths. If you've been to airports in the Middle East lately, you know it's already here. If you're already registered with the country, you walk up to a camera, you look at the camera, the gate opens, and you're in the country. No long lines, no immigration queues. But if you also are paying attention as you go around those cities, some of those modern cities in the Middle East, if you notice, there are cameras everywhere. Those cameras are tied to facial recognition systems that therefore know where you are at all times and know who you are. That's resulted in some cities, in Europe and in the United States, in significant decreases in urban crime. Very significant decreases in urban crime in areas where camera surveillance systems have been put in and tied to facial recognition. Number 8, hypersonic vehicles. The United States, China, and Russia have all announced the existence of experimental hypersonic vehicles that travel at the speed 5 times the speed of sound. The United States has one that it says travels at 20 times the speed of sound. Hypersonic missiles with accurate guidance systems. We'll come back to that. Number 9, mini satellites, and commercial space launch. Low Earth orbit is being filled with satellites that cost very little to make. They're about the size of this podium and cost very little to launch. That means all sorts of new communications technologies and sensor technologies will be available to lots of people. And 10th and lastly, 5G communications and the Internet of Things. I tie these two together because 5G will really make the Internet of Things work, and without 5G, it won't. Now, you say, what's 5G? I remember when we moved from 3G to 4G, the only thing that changed was the sign on my cell phone that said 3G once and then later said 4G. I didn't notice any change. That's true. You're right. But when you move from 4G to 5G, that's not a 10 times increase. That's a 100 times increase in speed and bandwidth. The international requirement, the standard for 5G, is that 1 million devices simultaneously connect within a square kilometer. 1 million devices simultaneously connecting to the internet over the 5G network in a square kilometer. That's what we're building. It's already here. The future is here. 5G is in some parts of Washington, D.C., and Atlanta and Dallas and other cities. And elsewhere in the world, it's even further deployed. What it means is that devices everywhere will be connected rapidly to the internet. Everything, every kind of device you can imagine will be connected to the internet. Now, there are more technologies than these 10, but these 10 give us an idea of the future that has arrived, as Gibson said. The future that has arrived but is not evenly distributed. We know, therefore, what the immediate future, what the near future, what the planning horizon future looks like, because we can take these proven technologies, things that are working today, and just project their proliferation over the course of the planning horizon. What's the planning horizon? It's 5 to 10 years. The more you go into those 10 years, the less likely you are to be accurate. When the great George Shultz was Secretary of State, he asked the State Department Intelligence Bureau to give him predictions of what would happen, to foresee for him what would happen in international affairs in the next 5 years, in the second Reagan administration. And I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Intelligence at the time, and the task fell to me. And I thought that was the stupidest task I had ever been given. And rather than predict what would happen in the next 5 years, I went back 5 years and looked at the things that had happened over the course of those 5 years and whether anybody had accurately predicted them. And all of the major events that had shaped our foreign policy and our national security, almost all of them, in the preceding 5 years, had not been predicted 5 years earlier. If you want to do that exercise now, you'll find exactly the same thing is true. We're not good in the intelligence community, we're not good as national security and international relations specialists at predicting politics and predicting the future. But technology we can. Technology we can predict with some degree of accuracy. Certainly the technologists are better at predicting than those of us who got our degrees in international relations. So taking a look at those 10 technologies that I discussed, what kind of a future are we looking at? There's a way of taking those 10 technologies and saying, we have a utopian future. A utopian future that many in this room will see come to life and spend their lives in. People in college today are going to live probably to be 100. There will be life extension. That's already foreseeable. The technology is already there. And what kind of a world will they live in? When the 20-year-olds of today are 80, what kind of a world will they live in? Will it be utopian? It could be. Using the CRISPR-Cas9 and the gene editing techniques, we could eradicate enormous numbers of diseases that are either genetically created or can be genetically defeated. So we could live in a world without the pain and suffering of so many diseases that ruin lives today. We could live in a world that was highly secure because of facial recognition technology, because of surveillance technology. We could suppress crime in urban environments even further than we have already. But all of these same technologies could also produce a dystopia. The facial recognition technologies, the surveillance technologies, could create a big brother police state worse than anything we have imagined in the past. We're beginning to see that future already in China as facial recognition and surveillance cameras are deployed by a police state. We could see a world of hyper war. What's hyper war? Hyper war is war that instead of taking years, instead of taking months, occurs in days. Days from initiation to massive destruction and the finish of the war. Hypersonic weapons that travel with high accuracy at 5 or 20 times the speed of sound could destroy infrastructure by precisely targeting them, could destroy infrastructure in a matter of hours. What we saw last week with the attack on Abqaiq, if you think about that, how primitive was the technology that was used? Primitive drones with GPS systems, very simple, inexpensive cruise missiles, probably 19 missiles and drones total. And the damage they did to Abqaiq was massive. They could have kept going. They could have destroyed all of it. They still can't. And that with very cheap technology for which there is a very low barrier of entry. Think about a war in which China or the United States or Russia is engaged, where as the hypersonic missiles come raining down in their hundreds with great precision in a matter of minutes from their launch, a cyber war is initiated at the same time. A cyber war that attacks the infrastructure that the missiles don't attack. A cyber war that shuts off electric power grids and destroys the transformers and generators. A cyber war that turns off natural gas and oil pipelines and blows up the pumping stations. This is not future technology, this is technology that we know exists today, because we've seen it demonstrated already in attacks by Russia on the Ukrainian power grid, on simulated attacks that the United States has carried out on cyber ranges. So there are choices. There are choices of a utopian future in which we all live in safe, clean, energy-efficient cities, secure cities, or futures in which we live in the ruins of those cities. Those are the choices that we have, and we can shape them. In 1945, people looking at nuclear power and nuclear weapons saw two possibilities: a world of cities destroyed by nuclear bombs, or a world powered by nuclear reactors. Neither of those things occurred. One of the reasons that the cities destroyed by nuclear bombs didn't occur was that a lot of people, like here in the room, like us, worked hard to do nuclear arms control, worked hard for peace, for conflict reduction, for confidence building measures, for risk reduction measures. And we have therefore made it since 1945 without a nuclear weapon being used in anger. So when you think about the futures that I've discussed here and that will be discussed by our great panels today, don't think about it passively, Don't think about it as this is something that is going to happen and I just have to accept it. Think about the futures as things we can shape. Think about the futures and the technologies that are coming along as things that we don't have to accept will produce dystopian outcomes, but they are technologies that we can harness, we can control, or we can reject if we understand them and if we act together. The future, I think, will be shaped by those who can see many alternative futures and pick the best one possible. That's why I want to commend Paul and the Institute for having this discussion, so that we can see the futures that could exist in the Middle East. Futures shaped by climate change, where cities are no longer inhabitable, or futures where we have achieved, through technology, cities that are wonderful to live in. Landscapes populated by the destruction of war, or landscapes populated by people learning and producing new technologies. Think about the futures that could exist and choose the one that we want. Choose the best one for humanity. So I think you're going to have fun today with these panels. I think you're going to have fun thinking about the future and the future we want in the Middle East and in the world in general. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dick and Paul, for your introductory remarks. And I think what Dick had to say is a great segue into what we're going to try to accomplish today. Because Dick laid out 10 technologies that are going to shape our world, talked a little bit about some of the great challenges that we're going to confront, what are the opportunities, what are the risks. But as we all know, these things don't operate in a vacuum. They don't operate apart from one another. What happens with the climate will influence what happens with global economies. What happens with demographic growth will influence what happens with the rise or fall of violent extremism. And so what we're going to try to accomplish today in the two panels that we have, two outstanding panels with Steve Kenny and Patrick Tucker moderating, is to try to bring out the interrelationships of these trends, to help everybody think through and understand a little bit about how all of these factors are going to affect one another, how they may shape the direction that we go in, and how we might, as Dick said quite correctly, how we might, as individuals, as citizens, try to influence and shape those futures in ways that bring us to a positive outcome, bring us to in a direction that we want to move in. So that's what we're going to try to accomplish. The first panel is going to look at what the trends and trajectories are. Where do we think we're going? What do we think that the future between now and 2030 holds in store for us? And then the second panel is going to take those same issues and try to think through and discuss with all of you what the policy options might be. What might the United States do? What might our friends and partners in the region do in order to ensure that the positive outcome that Dick talked about, the utopian outcome, if you will, is actually the one that we can achieve and not move towards a dystopian or destructive outcome where the Middle East is a tragic region of conflict and instability. One of the things that we're going to try to accomplish today also with this great new facility that we've talked about is to give you and the audience a new opportunity to participate in the conversation, to be a part of the discussion in a way that we haven't had the ability to do in the past. And so one of the things that we've done is we have installed Mentimeter in this conference hall. And if you all want to take out your telephones and go to the www.mentimeter.com website and put in that code, you will get a screen on your phone that's going to allow you to participate in the conversation in a way that we think is going to be interesting for you and will help the panel understand what you think and what you believe are the right answers. There are two options that we're going to be using today. When the screen is dark, you will see on your phone an opportunity to ask questions. So we're not going to be passing around a microphone at the end of the day to get one or two people to be able to ask. All of you will be able to ask a question during those periods where the screen on your phone is displaying that option. The moderator will see the questions that you ask, and you'll also notice that when you ask a question, there will be, or when you have that screen up, there will be an opportunity for you to like questions that other people have asked. And if other people have asked a question that you think is interesting, that you would like to know the answer to, if you like that question, then the moderator, Steve or Patrick, will be able to see that this is a question of general interest, that this is something that you and the audience would really like to hear the answer to, and can use that information as a way of helping to steer the panel discussion in a way that gives you greater control of the direction of the conversation. The second thing that we'll have is polls. And during the course of the panel conversations, we will put up several opportunities for you to respond to polling questions to decide what you think are the key challenges. And what we're going to do now to begin this conversation and to begin the transition to the first panel is to put up the first poll. And all of you who have logged on to Mentimeter should have this polling question on your screens. What do you, as the audience, believe are going to be the greatest challenges confronting the region over the next 10 years? Whether it's climate change, terrorism, civil war, cyber warfare, migration. And as you're voting, as you're trying to think through, let me invite Steve Kenny to bring the first panel to this podium.
Yeah, what is the password for wireless password?
We had it back here.
Yeah, it's. So let me, while you're doing that, let me introduce Steve Kenny. Steve is the founder and principal of Foresight Victor LLC, a firm providing specialty advisory services and strategy development and implementation, organizational culture, organizational change, and leader development. Recognized for his expertise and strategic foresight for more than 25 years, Steve has advised government, corporate, and nonprofit sector organizations on how to create their future. Steve's work helps client organizations and their leadership teams to define their direction and adapt their plans, people, processes, and more to be able to achieve their greatest success. Prior to founding Foresight Vector, he was a vice president at Monitor 360 and partner with Toffler Associates, the executive advisory firm founded by world-renowned futurist Alvin Toffler. So Steve, please.
let us all get settled here, and we'll get started in just a moment.
I'll just ask questions as I'm thinking about it.
All right, can folks hear me?
Let's turn it that way.
All right. I'm trying to see the responses that are coming in here already. All right. Well, thank you. As Jerry said, I'm Stephen Kenny. I'm really delighted to be here today with all of you and with this fantastic group of panelists. And I'm really thrilled to be working with MEI as they're breaking new ground and bringing strategic foresight into the work that they do. There's a rich discipline of tools and methods of strategic foresight, one that I've drawn on and built on in my work for more than 20 years. And I think it's often not fully understood or recognized for what it is and for what it can do. To me, it's really powerful to think about what MEI and other think tanks can do as they tap more into that discipline of strategic foresight. Think tanks already do exceptional work in advancing the thinking about the topic areas that they focus on, taking often a vantage point of standing in the present, developing a very rich understanding of the dynamics of the present, and then looking forward from that vantage point. Strategic foresight kind of flips that paradigm on its head, and it begins from a position of standing in the future, or as Dick Clark said, standing in a range of possible futures, and with the same kind of rigor, working backwards and looking to what are the different ways, plural, that those different futures, plural, might emerge. And so to me, it's really inspiring that MEI is taking this step to really bring this kind of methodology and this kind of work in alongside the great work that they already do. Today's conference is the first example of that, an early example of that, and something that they intend to do a lot more of. And the aim in this panel and the aim the whole day is to do exactly that, to look not at the future of the Middle East, but at a range of possibilities for the future of the Middle East. And with that, I'll get us jumping in here. Let me introduce the panelists that we have here today, and I'm going to read for a moment so that I can do justice to the stature of the biographies of the people that I'm sitting here with. Paul Salem here, next to me, who you've already heard from a bit this morning, is the president of MEI. He focuses on issues of political change, transition, conflict, and the regional and international relations of the Middle East, with an emphasis on the countries of the Levant and Egypt. Paul writes regularly in the Arab and Western press, has been published in numerous journals, and has authored and edited numerous books, including most recently, From Chaos to Cooperation Toward Regional Order in the Middle East in 2017 with Ross Harrison. Next to Paul is Amal Kendall. Amal is the director of the Climate Change, Environment, and Human Security Program here at MEI. She also advises government international, including the UN Food Organization and many others, on economic and public policy, natural resources and sustainable development, and conflict, peace, and human security issues in the MENA region. She's also a writer on these issues for the Atlantic Council and has worked at the Library of Congress and taught at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Next to Amal is Josh Korbel. Josh is a veteran intelligence officer, and he's currently a member of the research faculty at the National Intelligence University. He's previously served at the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Navy staff, and the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the CIA. He's a prolific speaker and author, including pieces in Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, The National Interest, Parameters, American Diplomacy, War on the Rocks, and other outlets, and is a recognized authority on innovation and advancements in methods of analysis. Next to Josh is Dr. Elham Hagigat. Elham is a professor of political science and the chair of the political science department at Lehman College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's an interdisciplinary scholar with deep expertise in demography, development, democratization in the MENA region, and she's widely published in journals as well as the author of several important books, including most recently, Demography and Democracy, Transitions in the Middle East and North Africa from Cambridge University Press. And finally, next to Elham, we have Dr. Peter Schlosser. Peter is the Vice President and Vice Provost of the Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University. He's the University Professor of Global Futures there and holds joint appointments in ASU's School of Sustainability, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the School of Engineering. Dr. Schlosser joined ASU in 2018 from Columbia University, where he was the Maurice Ewing and J. Lamar Wurtzel Professor of Geophysics, the Chair of the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering, Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and the Deputy Director and Director of Research at the Earth Institute. That's a lot of hats, Peter, all at once. Format we're going to take here today, rather than have each panelist in turn give kind of a prepared presentation, we'll make it more conversational, more of a Q&A type of approach. And let me start with you, Josh, if I may. A lot of your work focuses on anticipatory intelligence, which you describe as a new approach for understanding complex systems and for envisioning possibilities before they emerge. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by complex systems and emergent developments, and what are the kinds of things that policymakers and scholars should be looking for to understand and anticipate them?
Sure. Forgive me, I have a little bit of a cough, so I'm sucking on a cough drop. So,
Josh, maybe I think if you push that button to go green, that should help. There you go.
does that help? Okay. Complexity. So let me start by saying, I like to think that we all hear this phrase that the world is increasingly complex. I like to say that that's sort of the greatest cliche in Washington, D.C. Not because it's not true. It certainly is true. But because we say it, implying that there is this significant change, and then we proceed to do what we've always done. And this is a challenge. And when I say what we've always done, what I really mean is we tend to think about problems as though they were complicated problems, vice complex problems. In idiomatic English, we tend to use complex and complicated interchangeably. But in scientific English, they mean very different things. And a complicated system is very different from a complex system, and you need to think about it very differently. If you try to bring the rules of complicated systems to complex systems, you're setting yourself up for trouble. And most importantly, you're setting yourself up for surprise. So in the national security structure in the United States, our formative experience really was a complicated problem, right? The Soviet Union was a complicated problem. The Cold War was a complicated problem. And by that, I mean it was essentially a closed system with a hierarchical structure with a very limited number of interactions in it. Okay? And as you went down through that structure, there was less and less horizontal knowledge. And systems that are complicated tend to have a significant degree of certainty attached to them. They tend to behave in a sort of mechanistic fashion. They often are predictable. And they adhere to a certain set of rules. And if you think according to those rules, you can have a pretty good understanding of how that system is going to behave. And these rules are something that in our educational system tend to be ingrained in us. So nobody ever explicitly ever says to us, think according to these rules. But as I go through them, you'll probably see that they have been reinforced in most of us as we've been educated. Rule number one is this notion that the system that the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. Rule number two is this notion that there's identifiable cause and effect, particularly in retrospect. Rule number three is that the system is repeatable. How it's behaved in the past and how it's behaving currently is likely to indicate how it behaves in the future. And rule number four is that there's proportional input-output, right? A little bit of an input gets you a little bit of an output. Those rules are great for thinking about complicated systems. Those rules are not your friend if you're trying to think about complex systems. Complex systems are systems that tend to be blurry-edged, they tend to not be hierarchical, they tend to be flat, and they tend to be highly networked and very dynamic, constantly changing with a huge number of relationships, constantly developing and morphing. If you try to apply those rules to a complex system, you're in trouble. And the notion of anticipatory intelligence, or anticipatory thinking, I should actually term it, is really about anticipating how a complex system might behave. And systems tend to generate what we often term emergent effects. Emergent effects are nonlinearities that can just bubble up and sort of take over the system in some ways. By definition, they're really sort of micro behaviors of the agents inside that then lead to sort of macro behaviors. Sort of one of the classic examples I would imagine that you've wrestled with is the example of the Arab Spring. I don't know if you actually use that terminology. I'm not a Middle East expert at all. But that's a classic example of emergent phenomena, right? And you have to anticipate emergence. Emergence can't be predicted, which means you have to think differently. And that's this notion of those rules of linearity. Complex systems are not linear systems. And so you have to think differently.
Thank you. Now that Josh hopefully has got the juices flowing, I'm going to switch to the opportunity for the audience to start inputting questions. See if I can do that. Technical assistance here with that.
Technical assistance?
Advance to the next slide here. There we go. Okay. So, Paul, let me turn to you. I mean, you and I have talked before about how you think about the Middle East as a system. So Josh has described what he terms a complex system. Middle East, in my non-expert opinion, certainly is one. But how else would you characterize the system in the Middle East? And what are some of the implications of those systems' characteristics that you observe for how things might play out in the future?
Well, a number of things come to mind to me when thinking about that. One is that the Middle East, maybe 10, 20 years ago, could be said, at least at the political level, to have a recognizable system of functioning states, a certain regional order, certain relations with the global powers, a slower pace of revolutionary technological change at the time that wasn't yet a major game changer. But what we've seen, whether it was indirectly caused by advances in technology or by that plus climate change plus governance and economic issues, that's something for people to go back and look at in the Arab uprisings and so on. But certainly it was kind of an unpredictable, and as Josh said, kind of what they describe in complex systems theory as an emergent and surprising development that took over the system. When I look now, a number of things come to mind. One is the Middle East is currently not a system, not even in a sense a complex system that's functioning and you can try to figure out. It is not in equilibrium. It is in disequilibrium. Hence, even if you don't think of extraneous impacts of all the things we might talk about today, demography, climate change, it itself is a disequilibrium and might tip in unpredictable ways that have no systemic sort of predictability to them. A second thing that strikes me is when I look at the Arab world in particular, my reflection is in the past, we used to have a future. What I mean by that if you go back to even 1940s or 1920s or 1960s, leaders, governments, and populations had maybe competing visions of the future, but there was a great focus on what we want to achieve in the future. Is it nationalist unity? Is it socialist state? Is it social justice? The future goals and future thinking, both in nation states and in regional politics, was a very powerful driver. In some works that look at the 20th century, that is also true of other regions of the world. And we've reached the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, having lost a vision or a political, commitment to a particular part of future. And what we're seeing is competition for various types of nostalgia for the past. Obviously, you see it in outside the Middle East, whether it's in Russia, a little bit in the US, make America great again. We don't know what's coming, but we know what happened before. We want to go back to it. ISIS is certainly a clear manifestation of the future doesn't look good. Let's reclaim something in the past. So there's a lack of vision as well, which is why I think this type of work and this type of thinking is very important for the region to think about that future. And the final comment I will make may be pivoting on something Dick Clark said, in the sense that the future in the Middle East is already here, in the sense that we've seen the disruptive impact of climate change. It's here, it's disrupted countries, it's disrupted the region, and it's going to get more impactful. We've seen the disruptive effect of technology and how that's become sort of something that creates change in all different directions. We've seen the impact of demographic growth, demographic change, and its combination with sluggish economies and high unemployment. So the forces of instability, of unpredictability, the bad case scenarios of state collapse, civil war, we've seen in some cases. We've seen success stories as well in some parts of the Gulf and the Middle East. So we're already sort of looking at that map of how bad it can get, and maybe that there is hope that we can grapple with it. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Ellen, Paul just made a reference to demographics and disruptive effects that we're seeing in the Middle East region from a variety of factors, demographics being one of them. Excuse me. You've written about how the region has one of the highest population growth rates in the world, and that there are really profound changes going on in a number of other demographic indicator areas. Could you talk a little bit about what are some of those demographic changes that, in your view, are likely to have the greatest kind of defining impact on the future of the region?
Yes. I'll push that button. Thank you. To put it in a larger context, I probably should start with the rate of natural increase, which is, and I'm going to look at my notes because I have to refer to some numbers. So try to make it as conversational as possible, but because of numbers, I just want to be correct. So rate of natural increase for the world is 1, which means there is a steady population increase. If it was 0, there won't be any increases. When we look at the so-called developed world, the rate of natural increase is close to 0. And then a country like US, for example, is 0.4. It's close enough to 0. And it's pretty much the crude birth rate minus the death rates. That's how you get that number. Then you look at countries like the Middle East and North Africa region. There are rate of natural increase that is low in some of the countries, and some are very high. And generally speaking, when we look at the demographics of the world, the developing, this again, I have to use those words that we use in academia, the developing world, less developed world, that's where the population growth is, almost 90%. And then 10% is in the developed world. And Middle East and North Africa has one of the highest population increases. Now it's continent of Africa, but Middle East was number 1 for a very long time. So when we look at the region, Middle East and North Africa, we find countries like Bahrain, Iran, Lebanon, Qatar, Turkey. They're about 1.2, 1.1. The high rate of natural increase are countries like Yemen, Syria, Egypt, as high as 2.6, 2.4, Iraq 2.6, Yemen 2.8. And then mid-level would be Saudi Arabia, for example, which is 1.8, Kuwait is 1.7. So that gives you a picture of the trend. And definitely there is no question that the population is not only growing, but it's growing very fast in many of these countries. So for example, in the most populous countries, Egypt, Iran, Turkey, by 2030, Egypt is going to have over 110 million people. Now it's 88 million, about 90 million. Iran is going to be 90 million by 2030. Turkey, almost 90 million. So by the mid-century, Egypt, almost 150 million people is going to be the population of Egypt. So that's something that we are going to see, even if many of these countries, they have reduced their fertility. And that's one way to make sure that the population doesn't grow if the state and the country doesn't want to have that growth. So that fertility has dropped tremendously in many of the countries in the region, but the growth is going to continue for a while until much later, several decades from now. So your question is, what's the impact? So when you have your population doubling in a way every 20, 30 years, or growing much faster than the services, social services, education, employment is available for your population, you are going to see a lot of changes and demands for that. So that's something that we not only have seen the present, it is going to continue in the future, putting it in the context that you were talking about earlier. There are countries that they are very small and they are going to stay small. Lebanon, for example, 5 million. Libya, 6. Palestinian territory, although very dense, 4 million. Jordan, 8. And the Gulf states, they also have very small populations, under 10 million. When you have a rate of natural increase of 2, that translates to doubling their population almost every 30 to 50 years. Now the question is, what else is happening in those countries? Life expectancy is higher, which means people live longer lives, healthier lives. When you look at a country like Yemen, for example, even Yemen falls behind many of the demographic indicators. Life expectancy was not that long ago, a couple of decades ago, which is the expected years that a person who lives in Yemen lives. It was around 40s, 45, 48, 50. Throughout the whole Middle East and North Africa and the world, actually, life expectancy at birth has increased tremendously. So that tells you that, the dynamic of the population also changes when you have people living longer. The services are going to be different. People are actually going to get old instead of dying when they're in their 50s, in the definition of what old is, obviously. Then there is another interesting trend that you find in the region, which is something that we need to pay attention to, is we call it in demography, we call it sweet spot or demographic gift. So when you have a very large population of young people, that is a sweet spot for a state, for a government. So it's a gift. Now it will be a gift if you know how to take advantage of it. If it's a gift that is unwanted, then it becomes a problem, right? Because you have a very large, disproportionate young population that they are probably educated, or they want education. They are then they want jobs. If the jobs are not available, employment is not available. Unemployment rate is very high, and going back to the region, unemployment rate among the youth is very, very high, especially among young people and women. So that creates a lot of tension, obviously, and conflict, especially the youth that have done their work, meaning that they've been educated, they went to college, they graduated, and they're wondering where are the jobs, where can they get settled, when can they start their families, and so forth. So these are the pieces that we see, and I know I need to stop.
No, and I'd like a little later on in the panel to come back to the youth issues, some of the trends and implications there. And for those of you in the audience, we put up another one of the poll questions that Jerry referenced here related to the demographic issues that Elam has been talking about here. Give you another few moments here if anybody wants to weigh in on what you think the answer to this question is about the percentage of the countries in the region that will double their population in the next 30 to 50 years. That's that rate of natural increase that she was referencing. So we'll leave that up for another moment. And then in just a moment, I will put the audience question opportunity back up for all of you. To shift gears a little bit, Amal, let me turn to you. You and I talked earlier this week about climate change, which has also been, I'll go back to the first polling question. I think that was the winner in terms of what...
Maybe turn off the others, yeah.
What a lot of the people in the audience thought is the most pressing issue that the region is going to be facing in the future. And when you talked about the impacts of climate change, particularly on food security and water security. Could you talk a little bit about those dynamics, about the interrelationships between those three issues and what you think some of the potential implications are for the future of the region?
Sure. So certainly there are multiple factors underlying the present trajectory of water security and food security in the region, and therefore of human security more broadly. It's not a good trajectory, and climate change, of course, plays a part in it. First, when it comes to the state of water resources in the region, all indicators we have that tell us about the sustainability of the resources. I'm sorry, it is on. Yes.
It's on, yeah.
So we'll put the audience questions back up while Amal is talking. Please go on.
Yeah, so all the indicators we have that tell us that's nothing. It's very special. Thank you.
A bit close to your mouth.
Yes, okay, all right. So with population growth, for example, water scarcity is rising. With expansion in economic development, water stress is deepening, and therefore reliability and security of the resources is deteriorating. When it comes to food security, the trajectory has taken a U-turn actually within the last 30 years. Since 1990 up until 2011, things were actually improving in terms of food security conditions. But starting with the Arab uprisings and their aftermath, things took a U-turn and deterioration set in, and some of the achievements of the preceding 2 decades were eroded in some of the region's countries. As a result of this, today we have about 52 million people in the region who are food insecure in different degrees, and that's more than 3 times what the number was in 1990. Actually, the region is the only one in the world in which the percentage of people experiencing these conditions of food insecurity of different degrees has actually increased over the 30-year time period. The major cause of this has been regional wars, and that is evident in the fact that about 85% of these 52 million people live in the Mashriq area, where 2 of the most hot conflict zones are concentrated. Climate change comes into the picture and complicates things because it's amplifying risks to water and food security under these precarious circumstances for 2 main reasons. One is the nature of the physical impacts of climate change that are projected to occur in the region and the extent of the region's exposure to these impacts. And the other reason is a set of dependencies that the region has in terms of its water resource systems and its agricultural system. So when it comes to the impacts of climate change, the physical impacts that are projected, we know that the region will continue to get hotter and drier. Droughts will increase in both intensity and duration in a region that is already, experiences one of the harshest climates on the planet, being, dominated by desert climate, both in North Africa and in West Asia. It's also quite exposed to sea level rise because the majority of the economic activities and centers and urban population centers in the region are concentrated in coastal areas. So it's pretty vulnerable all around from these major 4 impacts of climate change. But an important factor that actually underlies the sensitivity of the region to these physical impacts of climate change is a set of dependencies that include, number 1, high dependency on external water resources, freshwater resources that are originating outside the region. They come in transboundary river systems where the headwaters are emerge outside the region's territories. In addition, there is still a significant dependency, despite these limitations on agricultural land and water, there is still a significant dependency on the agricultural sector for employment and livelihoods, because there's about 40% of the region's population are still rural and mostly engaged in agriculture or depend on agricultural livelihoods even indirectly. It's essential activity in rural economies. In addition, the majority of the region's cultivated land is actually rain-fed, which means it's quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change as well. And on top of this, about 3/4 of the small farmers in the region are engaged in rain-fed farming systems. So that kind of complicates things even more when it comes to their sensitivity to climate change impacts. The last important thing is that the majority of the region's water, 85 to 90% of the region's water resources, are used in the agricultural sector. And the outcome of all these things put together is that the region is the most food import dependent region in the world. At the same time, those small farmer communities, which are very prominent in the region and at the same time quite vulnerable to climate change, produce the majority of the domestic production of agri-food products. So when you bring in climate change, it is certain that the region will experience serious consequences on human systems, on natural resource systems, and economic systems because of it. That is the trajectory we have.
I think what Jerry said, introducing the panel here before we sat down, about the interrelationships between these issues here, and what you just talked about, Amal, show so many connections between climate change and economy and employment and so many other things, and how those things in turn are contributing to and fueling climate change. So I think that's a terrific example of the complexity of these interrelationships among different issues and issues areas. Peter, Amal has kind of zeroed in on the climate change impacts in the region. Let me ask you to zoom out a little bit to the larger global context in which those regional impacts of climate change are playing out, and what are some of the dimensions, dynamics of that larger global context that policymakers and people who are interested in the region really need to understand?
Yeah, thanks for this intro. What we are seeing globally, and I should preface that we have talked quite a bit about systems. So the Earth system as a whole is the ultimate complex system, and it's not in equilibrium. So we have to figure out how to deal with understanding and projecting complex systems that are under a number of pressures. And what are these pressures? I think that the biggest issue that we have globally is that the human domain is way out of equilibrium with the rest of the Earth system. What that means is we are putting a lot of pressure from multiple directions onto the Earth system, which pushes us against what typically is called planetary boundaries. Especially with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, humankind thought the planet is limitless. In space, in resources, anything we need, the planet can supply. We know now that this is not the case. In essence, we are asking the planet as a whole to give more than it has to offer. And some of these boundaries that we are hitting have been mentioned. I saw the initial graphic which highlighted climate change. Climate change is something where there's an area where we are seeing more and more events that are seen as extreme events. But in essence, you could say that's triggered by use of fossil fuels. So in essence, as a consequence of climate change, and that is not just in the Middle East, we are putting pressure on water cycles, and we are also putting pressure on water cycles by using too much. So we are mining old groundwater and we are polluting it at the same time. All of that goes into the food system, and that is hitting human health directly. So given all that, leads to the fact that we have what many people would say arrived in the Anthropocene, which means humankind has touched every part of the globe. You can go to the deep Pacific or the outer atmosphere, you find the fingerprints of human activity. And in many cases, we are now at the point where we are pushing through these boundaries and we are really threatening the habitability of the planet. And we see that very clearly in some areas, Arctic Ocean. Sea ice extent, we will go towards the minimum for this year within a few days. It will be probably the second lowest. For a long time it was on course for a record. When I first tried to go with an icebreaker into the Arctic in '87, we sort of just bounced off at the edge because there was a lot of ice. In 2015, the last time that we were up there, you could go from the Bering Strait straight to the pole without encountering ice. So we have these major changes, and just coming back to climate for a moment to illustrate how they play out. For a long time, they were abstract somehow. I mean, we know since at least half a century, with the Club of Rome was roughly 50 years ago, Silent Spring, that things have changed all the way along, and that it was even then visible that we would put pressure upon ourselves and the planet. But at that time, we didn't feel it as much as we feel it now. If you just look at 2019, we had temperatures 20 Fahrenheit above normal in Alaska or in the Arctic as a whole. We had wildfires in Alaska, we have them in Brazil, we had the warmest July on record, we have another hurricane that shows not just strength and size, but also a behavior that we notice more and more, which is it stalls and just dumps water. I mean, if you look at the Bahamas, it was more than 24 hours of a continuous bashing, not just by high winds, but also by water that was just thrown onto the island. Houston actually is just drenched as we speak. And so we feel these things more frequently, in more places, closer to us. So where is that heading? We have already put 1 degree Celsius of temperature increase into the system. We have programmed another 1 degree that I do not see any way to avoid that, and that is sort of the Paris Accord upper limit. IPCC has said we should actually stay at 1.5, which some people still feel is too high, but there's no way we get below that. And with that, we, in essence, put more energy in it. Just to put that into context, what does it mean? A lot of people say, so 1 degree, 2 degrees, you have a daily temperature variability of sometimes 10, 15, 20 degrees Celsius. But if you look at averages, and that's what climate is all about, the average temperature difference between an ice age and a warm period was 5 degrees Celsius. If we go to the 2 degrees, and I'm sure we will go there, if not beyond that, we are 40% into a full cycle between an ice age and a warm age that we have seen over the past. During the last ice age, there was an ice sheet of 1 kilometer over New York. So these are drastic changes. Also, we are going in unknown territory. We are putting more energy into the system. We are putting more energy into the atmosphere. That's where the hurricanes are getting stronger. But we are also trying the certain areas out. We are, for example, in the southwest of the US, we are going into a permanent drought. And we are in that development. So now, just let's make the connection then to the area that we are talking about. The different parts of the world are not living in isolation. They are connected. And if we are putting pressure on them, they will get these regions out of their equilibrium. And one of the things that we have seen in the past few years is that if enough pressure is applied to a certain region, you might get people to leave it. You get migration. And it is projected in, looking ahead, that we will see more migration from different areas. Now, what does that do? We have seen that just a few million of refugees moving, let's just say, as a target, as one of the main target destinations, Europe, with several hundred million of people. So we are putting perturbations on the social side or on the population side of 1%, maybe a few percent into the system, and that led to absolute havoc in some areas in terms of, shifts of political views, of the views of society, acceptance or non-acceptance of these. So I think we are seeing the beginning of quite a few of these phenomena that can come from regions such as the Middle East, but also feed back onto it. Global activities put pressure on that region. There are dynamics that are specific to these regions. They feed back into the global system. So to sum that up, we have made choices as a society in the past that led to a situation where we have put the planet under pressure, and the planet in essence is getting back at us. We do have means to counter that, but we have to be willing to make different choices now, moving ahead, and avoid more types of crises like the climate crisis that we are seeing right now, and to get onto a sustainable trajectory, because right now we are strictly on a non-sustainable trajectory in all domains of the Earth system. And if we are not reacting to that, if we are not bringing up the societal will to change the way we deal with the Earth system, then the Earth system will self-regulate, it will be out of our control, and the consequences will not be pretty.
Thank you, Peter. I listen to what you're saying. There's so many contributing causes and elements contributing to climate change that are collectively leading to this very, very macro level change that you're talking about at the regional level, the global level. In a way, it seems to me an illustration of sorts of something Josh talked about at the beginning about micro behaviors having disproportionate levels of impact. I want to turn to, in that spirit, one of the audience questions here. Josh, I think you must have hit a nerve here. There's a question that is liked by more than half of the total number of people who have submitted questions here that I think is right in your wheelhouse. But others of you, please jump in on them if you'd like after Josh does. The question is, how do we anticipate micro-level changes that can lead to macro changes? And how do we tell the difference between a micro trend and a deep micro change that will lead to macro-level impacts and changes?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I guess it's the question that actually goes to the heart of what we're wrestling with here. The thing about thinking about complex systems, the first thing you just have to do is you have to accept a certain degree of humbleness, that you're not going to get it right. There's just so many possibilities, and there's so much uncertainty based upon the degree of interaction and relationships that exist. That you have to accept that uncertainty is now a fact, and we're not going to bring certainty to it. When thinking about that kind of uncertainty, what you really need to do is you need to exercise foresight. We often tend to combine foresight and use the word interchangeably with forecasting or projection or extrapolation, and they're not the same thing. You can use forecasting techniques, the sort of extrapolation of the past, as I talked about those linear rules, into the future pretty effectively with a complicated system. But when you're thinking about complexity, you need to think about foresight. And I would argue the most important thing that you need to do is you need to understand that analytical approaches to understanding and anticipating those possibilities, the many ways, because you don't want to try to come up with the answer. You want to think better questions, the possibilities. The most important thing is analysis. Breaking the problem down doesn't get you there. You have to learn to think synthetically. Some people use the word creatively today, but means you have to see the big picture. You have to be constantly opening the aperture. One of the things we know about complex systems is one of the reasons they surprise us is because we put a frame on it to try and manage our expectations and put some degree of control. And the frame is almost always too small. The things that surprise us, the things that lead to that sort of surprise, were actually something that was outside of that frame. So one of the ways to do this is by visualization techniques in terms of foresight. And I talk about this with my analysts all the time, that you have to create a picture. There's software that can help you do this, but you can do it with butcher block paper and dry erase markers and sticky notes. But you have to have some kind of visual picture of the things, the primary actors and the things that are interacting. And even then, you're simplifying it. You have to constantly be opening that aperture. Sometimes people are common, they often say, you need to think outside the box. You don't need to think outside the box. You need to blow the box up. That's the only way to sort of start to get your head around these. And even then, all you're really doing is getting at possibilities. But you want to think about those possibilities. Oftentimes, policymakers will say to me or say to analysts, they'll say, tell me what's most likely and tell me what's most dangerous. That's a terrible question, right? And an even more dangerous question to answer. Because if you answer that question, you're displaying a degree, I would think, of arrogance, of hubris, that you're going to get it right. And as Dick Clark said, we often don't get it right, because of this complexity. The right thing to look at is what are those possibilities, and what you're pursuing is resilience, right? With foresight, what you're trying to do in terms of anticipating is buy yourself some time. If you wait for emergence to happen, in a complex interconnected system, it happens so quickly and sweeps through so quickly that you're in a reactive mode. You can very easily find yourself the turtle on its back that can't flip itself over. And the whole idea of anticipatory thinking here is to think about these possibilities and to be resilient, to adapt yourself across the range of those possibilities, not to pick or choose one or the other, which are a good chance that you'll be wrong about. And then you have resilience. It really goes to the heart of preparation.
Paul, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to come in on that. And when I'm thinking about the Middle East, to look at sort of maybe three levels. There's the unanticipated, maybe unanticipatable thing. Maybe it's from emergence. Maybe some event happens. Sometimes that's called a black swan. Hard to see. Has a big impact. A level below that is what is a thing that we see can happen. We don't know if it's going to happen, but when it does happen, it's not a big surprise. Yeah, we saw that could have happened, like what's happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Maybe we couldn't have exactly predicted it, but it was in our thinking that something like that could escalate. And some people call that a gray swan, that you sort of see it out there on the horizon. It may fly, it may not fly. There's a number of those, certainly in the Middle East. But take it one step lower. The biggest things that are impacting the Middle East are present, they're visible, we know them. Some people call those gray rhinos, to use sort of terminology. It's like the big elephant in the room. Unemployment, demographic growth, poor governance or repression or non-inclusion, non-existence of a regional order to manage anything, and climate change. The problem with these types of problems is that we live with them for so long that you almost get used to them. Like, yeah, so we have unemployment. It's not, there's the danger of becoming inured to it. Maybe it's a little bit like climate change. Most people know it's happening. We're living with it somehow, and people get adjusted to it. So when I think about the Middle East, the first thing I think about is the gray rhinos. That we have to start, forget the big surprise that, maybe artificial intelligence will add another problem to our problems. But maybe in that way, it's a bit like climate change. It's not rocket science in the sense that you've got to reduce emissions, there are many things that we can do, and we clearly are not doing. And in the Middle East, there are 4 or 5 things that we must do, we can do, and we're not doing. Those obviously have to do with demographic growth, with economics, with governance, of course a very complicated question, and with regional order. We are busy fighting each other. We are busy fighting civil wars. We are very focused on what's happening yesterday, tomorrow, and after tomorrow. So dealing with those present problems is somewhere where we need to start. The second element of this gets to Josh's point about resilience. That, of course, we're not going to solve all the problems, and there's going to be other problems that are going to come tomorrow that we cannot anticipate. But we do not have minimal resilience in most cases because we haven't gotten the basics even halfway. So our societies are very unstable, they're very youth-heavy, there's high unemployment, poor governance, they're in a region which is at war with itself. The levels, there isn't even resilience, there's disequilibrium. So if we're thinking 10 years down the road, we've got to solve some of the problems we're facing, we're going to have to be resilient to catch what's coming and manage it. We're not at all there. And most importantly, we need to get the big institutions right. And the big institutions are the state, which needs to be many, many, many things which it isn't today, and the regional system. I can imagine Europe going through, maybe youth bulges and technological change, and it's having its bits of turbulence, a bit of Brexit, a bit of electoral uncertainty, but the sophistication of the states, the advances in the economies, and the European system, despite its hiccups and its flaws, gives Europe much more resilience. We have none of those things. And if the trajectories that we're on continue as they are today for another 10 years, I fear that we're in a very dangerous situation.
Thanks. You just used the word trajectory, and that's, I think a key issue in thinking about the future of any topic area is this tendency toward linearity. We think in terms of trends, and things will sort of continue on their current trajectory. Jerry introduced what I think a lot of us have already talked about here today, is the importance of thinking about different possibilities and what could shift things in the direction of those different possibilities. Amal, if I could, I want to ask you, following up on what you talked about earlier with respect to climate change and the impacts in the region, you painted a picture that's not very rosy. But what are some of the things that could potentially shift things in a different direction, toward a different set of possibilities with respect to climate change and climate change adaptation in the region, and how the region deals with the water security and food security and other kinds of issues that you talked about?
Well, Steve, I would just want to say before I do talk about the positive possibilities, unfortunately, I do have to say that I do believe that things can also get worse. And this is another type of change in the sense that the trajectory could accelerate. The reason for thinking this, particularly there are two things. The major one is the persistence of regional wars. I always think that there is no linear function that can tell us about the public health outcomes or consequences of a breakdown, for example, in a water systems or in agricultural systems. The longer these wars continue, I believe that there could be an acceleration of deterioration. And this can have feedback loops in other areas of the region. And I think this is important to keep in mind, because one of the ways to make sure things get better is really end wars right now, yesterday. Even one of the hot conflict zones needs to stabilize. If one more country is caught in a civil war, it doesn't have to be a regional war, even one more civil war in one country will cause things to deteriorate even more rapidly for that country and also for neighboring countries. So we really do need to keep this in mind. Unfortunately, it's a big thing for this region. Other things that, another major problem I have in mind, and it's an example of vulnerability and complex risk in the region, is a dispute like what's going on along the Nile River, within the Nile Basin, between Sudan and Egypt and Ethiopia, around issues related to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. This is a major infrastructural development that's been started in 2011 and continues in progress until now, and started in a process that had completely nothing to do with established principles of international law, and particularly international transboundary law. This is a development that's affecting two countries with a total population of something around 140 million or more. It is not a small thing. The problem is that they have no idea how this development is going to be affecting water resources, agricultural systems, stability generally. And this is the problem. This is why this deviation from international legal principles is very dangerous, because the consequences are very real. They can be consequences at a magnitude of human rights at some point, when livelihoods are lost, when there's dislocation, and at some point when the dam operates. And as we don't know, what the implications are going to be, there could be an exacerbation of migration from certain agricultural areas in Egypt, which are already under very huge stress. Same in Sudan. So these are two kinds of things that locally can make things worse on a sub-regional level. Now we can think of what can make things better, which is more interesting, obviously. The reversal of these two kinds of circumstances would obviously make things better. Putting the Nile dispute on a more orderly trajectory, principled process, where the rights of all countries are actually respected and the human rights of these populations are respected, is extremely important and can make a big difference. And ending conflicts, as I had mentioned, it's extremely important. But then there are two other important things I believe would be very helpful. One of them is just simply about raising awareness about climate change issues, impacts and risks. What are the consequences of these challenges? How can they be addressed, and what if they're not addressed? And I mean by raising awareness, raising it across all segments of societies in all the Middle East and North African countries, consumers, producers, policymakers. Everybody needs to know what they're up against so that everybody can be engaged. I think it would be very helpful, and I think people would appreciate being engaged in the making of a vision for the future rather than just having it dictated to them or delivered to them. There will be more positive changes and attitudes under these circumstances. Another important thing is policy and how policy is designed. So policies need to always keep in mind what we call sequencing of measures. And also policies need to be systems of policies have to be internally consistent and coherent and not have measures that work against each other, which is at present a lot of what we see in dealing with these complexities in the region, because they're very complex and because oftentimes the synergies and the trade-offs are not well understood. So it's important in design of policy frameworks, and what could go a long way towards improvements is to have them internally integrated in that way and provide incentives, I believe, for at least 4 things to happen. These are very important 4 things, and they are also interrelated. The first of all is to improve quite rapidly the management of natural resource systems in the region, particularly of water resources and of conservation. And I mean conservation of water in all sectors and among all users. I'm not just pointing fingers at agriculture, although it is the biggest user of water, but all sectors need to adapt and adjust. Incentives are also needed to accelerate the energy transition in the Middle East and North Africa countries, to expand, to broaden and deepen the deployment of renewables, particularly in countries that are net importers of energy, mostly in North Africa. Not all of the countries in North Africa, but many of them. I do not believe that the Middle East and North African countries ever need to import energy. They have absolutely enough. So this is a big piece of the solution, and an exciting piece because technologies are available. And it's a wonderful solution in many different ways. It's not just about adaptation and about mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. It has so many benefits for the region. Another important element of the incentives is that they need to help accelerate the adoption of all kinds of technologies for climate adaptation and all kinds of methods that are available and known, either piloted in the region in some countries or perhaps tried in other regions and would be relevant and applicable for the Middle East. And also, importantly, building on local and indigenous knowledge, because it's extremely helpful in environmental contexts. And the last piece, I think, would be that would be very helpful is also incentives to really create or help create a real rural transformation based on diversification of rural economies, particularly in those parts of the region that are still heavily dependent on agriculture, to reduce distance and create more resilience in these economies. And when you look at rural diversification and energy transformation, for example, put together, the enormous opportunities can be yielded from these kind of combinations. And I would like to add that they would be very helpful for women in the Middle Eastern countries as well, where opportunities for work are more limited in rural areas. There are so many more barriers for women to be in the market economy in these countries in rural areas because of norms and traditions and all kinds of things, high literacy rates. So it lowers the barriers for women to participate. And women are one of the most vulnerable groups to the impacts of climate change. Often in many countries of the region, not all of them, the participation of women in agricultural employment is quite high. But nonetheless, they are a great minority when it comes to the ownership, actually, of agricultural assets of land. So they're one of the most vulnerable communities in the region to the impacts of climate change.
Great, thank you. Thank you. In the time we've got left, Ellen, I said I wanted to come back to you to talk about youth, in part because I think there's a really important set of issues there that I'd like you to touch on, but also because it reminds me, Peter, of something you and I talked about earlier this week. So, Elham, when you think about the demographic changes and trends that you talked about earlier, particularly population growth, but others as well, what are potentially some of the impacts on the youth population in the region? If you could spend just a couple minutes on that, I think it's a really important piece of this puzzle.
There is this gift that we talked about that's there to be utilized by the governments, which is the youth. The problem that is going to be there, and is there now, also is the employment and unemployment. For example, if we look at the unemployment rate in Iran for the general total is 10%. For the youth is 30%. In Libya, 19% general total. For the youth population is almost 50%. Another example of Saudi Arabia, 6% for the total population, 30% for the youth. So that gives you a picture of the high rate, obviously, of unemployment. Unemployment usually for the youth is larger. To compare that with US, for example, US 6% is the total population unemployment. This was in 2012, 13% for the youth. So that's one of the issues that the region needs to deal with and obviously realize how important it is to create programs, to obviously, it's connected to the economy. And then another dimension to this is empowerment, inclusion of the population that is going to be the future of these countries and the region.
And that's exactly what I wanted to sort of segue into, and hopefully we'll have time for one last audience question as well. But so Peter, Ellen's talking about the impacts of some of these demographic trends on the youth population, the trends that Amal talked about, the gray rhinos that Paul's talked about, all are going to have their impacts on the youth population of the region. Let me again ask you to kind of flip that or zoom out a little bit. And what are some of the impacts that the youth population can have on these trends and on creating change in these areas? What can regional leaders and governments do to bring youth into the envisioning of the solutions in a way that Josh and others have talked about?
Yeah, what we're actually seeing is that because this has not happened, the youth actually has started movements, and there are two distinct ones. Most of you might have heard about Fridays for Future. That's where high school students actually use Fridays, each Friday of the week, to, in essence, strike. They don't go to school, but they go to townhouses, etc. And what they are saying actually what they are doing is, they say, we are feeling that things are changing. They are not changing in our favor. You, meaning the older generations, are narrowing our option space. We demand that you change that behavior. And when asked why, are they doing that, they say, of course we know that we are supposed to go to school, that we are supposed to use the time to get educated. But then they pose two questions that really sort of hit the core of this dilemma, where they say, why should we get educated for a future that might not be there? The second one is, why should we be educated if those who make decisions are not listening to educated people? And so, and these are the questions that we have to address. Some of you might have heard that Greta Thunberg, who sort of was one of the originators of these movements, she's in the US right now. She talked to a committee of senators yesterday, and they started to sort of, heap praise on that movement. And she said, keep the praise to yourself. We are not here for that. Focus on what you have to do. She said, we realize that you try, but you're not doing enough. You have to do more. And that was actually an expression that the other youth movement that is coming mostly out of the UK is Extinction Rebellion. That's what they call themselves. And they are actually promoting a method of civil disobedience. So they are peaceful but disruptive. And I think what they are saying is, you are taking our future away. Now that is not a single generation issue. So what we have to do, and there are pieces now being written by scientists, by other groups, saying this is a wake-up call, and we have to engage because it is a multi-generational issue. We have to engage in a dialogue with these young people, because otherwise they will turn into another group of protest voters, of people who might turn violent in their revolts, and a chance to actually work together in finding out how to implement the things that we know, because that's what they say. Greta Thunberg said to the senators, we are not here so that you listen to us. We are here to make the case that you listen to science and to do the things that science has outlined as possible. And that comes back to your remark, right? There are many things that we can do. Yes, we have to think about the future and where the nonlinearities might lead to rapid transition, to abrupt change. We have to be more anticipatory rather than just running behind and trying to solve problems we have created for ourselves. We have to avoid problems, but we also have to do the obvious. And that comes back to value systems. And the reason that we are often so paralyzed is that we are so stuck to value systems that we cannot get over that and find a consensus to move forward. And just one little note at the end of that. There were polls of the US population asking, do you believe in human-made climate change as a function of the degree? And that was then sorted by party affiliation. And if you go to the lowest degree of education, you have a separation between the two big parties, but not all that big, maybe 40-60. Then we all had expected that as you go to the higher degrees, that this comes closer together. It diverges, which is, it's a clear manifestation that knowledge in this case is used to justify the value system, rather than to listen to the objective information that we have. So there is a chance that we have, triggered by the youngest generation. I think it's up to us as a society as a whole to take that seriously, use it to get into a deep dialogue about what is the obvious thing to do now while we are figuring out the more uncertain things for the future.
With you to close things out, but we are out of time.
Do it quickly.
All right, this is a very dangerous thing to do with scholars, but one minute, there's an audience question here that has again been liked by almost everyone who submitted questions. So 1 minute from each of you, please. The question is, given the complex nature of the challenges in the Middle East that we're talking about, Can we only hope to react to crisis? Answer should be no. So the question to you is, what is something that we can do to address and solve challenges in the long term? A minute from each of you, please, to close us out, so I don't get in trouble with
Start
Jerry.
with me?
Yes, we'll just go down the line.
Yeah, I think I already sort of mentioned what I think, and I'll repeat something also that Emma said. One, end the civil wars, end the regional proxy war, which is the whole Iran largely, and a lot of it is also Israel related. None of this is easy, but I'm saying this needs to be done. Work on rebuilding and reforming states. And when you have those three, or while you're doing those three, of course, sustainable economics, job creation, while changing the energy mix. Those are things that are obvious, doesn't mean they're easy to do.
Amal.
Well, one of the things that probably needs to be accelerated is that developed countries need to fulfill their obligations in the Paris Agreement about contributing to the adaptation efforts of developing countries. The Green Climate Fund is supposed to have been receiving 100 billion every year since 2015, and it's by this year had received only 20 billion. So that's just one example. There are other funds. But generally speaking, it's a reflection of the seriousness of the commitments. Developing countries will depend on financing that's external to meet the gap in funds that they need to implement their adaptation plans. In the region like the Middle East and North Africa, it's responsibility for the greenhouse gas emissions is less than 5%, something like 4.5% or so. But it's extremely vulnerable to climate change and it needs to adapt quite rapidly. So it's a region that needs that external help. Many of its countries have fiscal difficulties and have debts and so on. So I think the international community needs to come together better and fulfill its obligations to do its part. That's an important piece.
Thank you. Josh.
I would say that what we really need to resist the urge to look at the world in such a way is that that's the Middle East and here is the United States. Like President Kennedy, said about he's a Berliner. The way the world is interconnected today, we're Middle Easterners. Everything that we do has an influence there, everything. Because when you're dealing with a complex system, you can never only do one thing. This is one of the great tricks about it, right? There are always secondary, third order effects that ripple through the system, and I mean the entire system. So I think I don't live in this community on an everyday basis, but I have a sense that we often in Washington and maybe in the United States in general often think that there's a distinction to be made here. And I would argue that there is no distinction. And I think it came out in the panel here, but everything that we do has an influence there, just as everything there has an influence here. And if we don't have that in our mindset, we have this sense that we can slice it and dice it and chop it up, we're deluding ourselves.
Elham and Peter, a minute from each of you, please. You will wrap.
Okay, I would say a few keywords: empowerment and inclusion. I'm a big fan of ground up. And when it comes to the region and the world, the next generation is the one that needs to be invested the most, have a voice, and brilliant minds and brains that's how they change the world, and that's how we see the world has changed with those having a voice. So voice, empowerment, and inclusion. That's my.
From the perspective of global society, I think we are not limited by knowledge. We are limited by the will to move. So I would say for the region and for the globe as a whole, we should use what we know is ready to be implemented and finally get our act together and not contemplate how to do it exactly, because if we're not doing it, time is running out. I mean, time has run out on us. So in essence, if we let that go a little bit longer, then we are hitting catastrophe. But we know how to do it.
Welcome back, everyone. It's now my honor to introduce His Excellency Dr. Thani Ahmed Az-Zayudi, the UAE Minister of Climate Change and our keynote speaker. We're delighted to have Dr. Zayudi join us today to address one of the most pressing issues facing the region that was identified in our first panel, the issue of climate change. His Excellency was appointed the Minister of Climate Change and Environment for the United Arab Emirates in February 2016. Previously, he served as a permanent representative of the United Arab Emirates to the International Renewable Energy Agency from 2010 to 2017. He was also the director of the Department of Energy and Climate Change in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 2010 to 2016. With that, I will welcome the minister to the podium.
Thank you, Jerry. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm really delighted to join you today at this conference on the future projections for the Middle East region that allows us to examine what the game changers for 2030 and beyond might be. I would like also to take this opportunity to congratulate the Middle East Institute for the opening of its new headquarters and wish them continued success in promoting wider understanding of the Middle East region's culture, art, and heritage. Distinguished guests, I'm coming from a country that has undergone a major transformation. Within just 4 decades, we have witnessed a comprehensive development boom. Our population surged from some 235,000 in 1970 to around 9.5 million today. The number of cars in the road increased from a few hundred to 3.4 million today, where we once had 2 airports, and now we have 7 international airports that cater to over 671,000 inbound and outbound flights a year. Among these is the Dubai International Airport, currently the world's busiest, which serves 75 airlines. As a maritime nation, the UAE is home to 20 seaports, including one of the world's top 10. These figures only give a glimpse of the country's development journey. However, the lightning speed of the UAE's transformation has put its scarce natural resources under immense pressure. You may know that the UAE has a limited supply of fresh water and availability of arable land, adding climate change to the mix. We realize the need to be very careful about maintaining the delicate balance between man and environment that allows both of them to thrive. In 1972, about 6 months after the formation of the UAE, a delegation from a newly announced country attended the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, the world's first environmental mega conference. The UAE's founding father, late Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, met with the members of the delegation before they embarked their journey. He told them that while they were heading to Sweden as representatives of the UAE's population, he expected them to speak for all the people of the world. And 1975 saw the first UAE Supreme Committee on Environment that drafted the country's first laws and regulations aimed at protecting the environment. Distinguished guests, the UAE was one of the first countries in the region to heed the climate change warning and ratify the Paris Agreement. Since then, we have followed a systematic approach toward climate change mitigation as well as adaptation. Despite its location in the heart of a region known for its dependence on hydrocarbons, the UAE launched the transition to renewables in 2006. Since then, the country has deployed large-scale renewable energy projects, such as Shams 1 concentrated solar power plant in Abu Dhabi, the 500 gigawatt Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid solar park in Dubai, set to be fully in operation in 2030, and the 1 gigawatt Noor Abu Dhabi, the world's largest single-site solar project, consists of 3.2 million solar panels. Maintaining the focus on renewables, a newly announced 2 gigawatt solar project set to outperform the record-breaking Noor Abu Dhabi plant is already in the work. Through its flagship company, Masdar, the UAE also developed investments of over $12 billion in more than 49 renewable energy projects, and over 23 of these are in the MENA region. Masdar's diverse portfolio of renewable energy assets currently represent around 4 gigawatts of clean energy capacity spread across the globe. Thanks to Masdar, the UAE has broken the world record for the lowest solar energy cost multiple times and emerged as the 21st century renewable energy impactful world player. And since 2013, the country has contributed nearly $1 billion in aid to developing countries to implement renewable energy projects that have transformed entire communities. In addition to renewables, we are seeking other sources of clean energy. In 2009, we established the Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation with a mission to deliver safe, clean, efficient, and reliable nuclear energy to the UAE grid. Once fully operational, its Baraka's nuclear energy plant, the first in the Arab world, will supply up to 25% of the UAE's electricity needs. Waste to energy is another promising clean energy option that we are already taking serious steps to achieve. 2 years from now, 3 major waste to energy plants will contribute to the grid and divert a huge amount of waste away from our landfills. We also have a national target to improve our energy efficiency by 40% by 2050. Due to our hot desert climate, we spend a huge amount of electricity on cooling. Our strategy tackles energy efficiency and supply as well as in use. In this context, we have widely deployed district cooling systems that, according to the Sustainable Development Goals Report 2018, reduce the amount of energy used for cooling by around 50%. To motivate members of the community to be mindful when using electricity, we have applied the slab tariff, under which consumers' utility charges depend on their usage. We have also replaced conventional lights in buildings and roads with energy-saving alternatives. And to lower fossil fuel consumption and encourage the use of public transport, we deregulate fuel prices and adopted a new pricing policy linked to the global rates. Determined to reduce its carbon footprint, the UAE has developed and deployed carbon capture and storage system and technologies. It's our national oil company, ADNOC, which has established the carbon capture and storage project to store CO2 from its own operation. Using the second and third generation carbon capture technologies, the leading CCS project captures 800,000 tons of CO2 a year. The transition to a green economy is a priority of the UAE's national agenda. We have made headway in establishing the country as one of the world leaders in green economy, as well as a hub for the export and re-export of green products and technologies. In addition to the environmental benefits, the drive supports long-term economic growth through creating new jobs and industries. All our efforts to diversify our economy and energy mix pursue one common goal: climate change mitigation. On the adaptation front, we initiated the National Climate Change Adaptation Program, a program aimed at boosting the UAE's climate resilience. The program assesses the impact of climate change on key sectors and identifies the risks that demand urgent action. Ladies and gentlemen, biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation are among the most disturbing effects of climate change. Sadly, scientists found that around 1 million species may be pushed to extinction in the next few years. The loss of even the smallest species can lead to destabilization of the world's ecosystems. And that's why in the UAE we have long been committed to preserving our local biodiversity. And we're continuing expanding our protected area. We also have a proven record of developing and implementing effective conservation initiatives to protect endangered species. Let me just give you a story on one of the local species that we have in the region. And for centuries, the African oryx had roamed remote areas around the world in large herds. But overhunting and habitat loss contributed to the steep decline in its numbers. Despite warning, the final herd in Chad disappeared. In 2000, the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species declared that the African oryx extinct in the wild. It seemed that another graceful creature was lost to the world. Urgent action was needed to guarantee the survival of the African oryx. We had the last few numbers of these in the captivity in the UAE. So we started our breeding program that saved the entire species from the extinction. At present, the Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Oryx Reintroduction Program released around 100 of animals into the protected area every year. We succeeded in bringing the beautiful antelope back from the brink of extinction. And I'm pleased to share with you today that the UAE is a home to 3,000 of these stunning creatures. But that is not how the story ends. We also joined forces with the government of Chad to reintroduce the African oryx into the Central African country. In 2016, 21 animals were transported from Abu Dhabi and released in the wild of Chad, a momentous milestone in the field of conservation. Nowadays, they have more than 120 African oryx in that protected area. The oryx is not a unique case in point. We are leading major efforts in saving multiple endangered species. The dugong, or sea cow, is one of the most unusual and elusive members of the marine world. Efforts to save the declining global population of the dugong took root in Abu Dhabi as early as 1967. Fishermen were banned from killing or hunting the sea cows. Efforts to protect the shy mammal have continued, with the UAE hosting the Secretariat tasked with implementing the multinational Dugong MOU and the inception of Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund, the agency responsible for dugong and seagrass conservation projects. Today, the UAE's rich blue waters are home to the second largest dugong population in the world after Australia. Our conservation efforts have also spanned the skies. The falcon, the national bird of the UAE, has been the focus of our conservation efforts for years. Thanks to Sheikh Zayed Falcon Release Program, around 2,000 falcons made their way back into the wild since 1995. We also established the Abu Dhabi Falcon Hospital, the world's largest hospital dedicated to falcons and a leader in avian medicine. The award-winning specialist hospital cares for around 6,000 falcons on average every year. Distinguished guests, our commitments to safeguarding biodiversity has been steadfast, and the threat of climate change has only made us more determined to win this fight. However, to succeed in our mission, we need to actively involve everyone: governments, businessmen, academia, and the public. To spur the focused and concerted climate action and step up climate ambition, we regularly hosted events that monitor the global response to climate change. Earlier this year, we had the privilege of partnering with His Excellency Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, to host the Abu Dhabi Climate Meeting. The takeaway from the event have set the course for the UN Climate Action Summit that will take place in a few days in New York. In closing, I really thank the Middle East Institute for organizing this conference. It's always a pleasure to meet seasoned experts and share notes. Remember, governments cannot act alone. Real change takes place only when all work together. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time, and I wish you very productive participation in this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency, for that presentation and very informative talk. We're going to go directly now to our second panel, which is going to explore ways to address the converging and growing future challenges that we discussed in panel one. This panel will be moderated by Patrick Tucker, Technology Editor for Defense One. He's also the author of The Naked Future, What Happens in a World That Anticipates Your Every Move. Previously, Patrick was deputy editor for The Futurist for 9 years, has written about emerging technologies in Slate, The Sun, MIT Technology Review, the Wilson Quarterly, the American Legion Magazine, BBC News Magazine, Utne Reader, and other publications. So please welcome Patrick and the panelists for number two. Let me also mention before we forget that at the end of panel two, we are going to put back on the screen the poll that we opened the conversation with on what you in the audience consider to be the most significant challenges confronting the region over the next 10 years. And we will see whether the discussions today have changed any minds. So with that, please.
Thanks.
Coming up. Yes, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We're a little bit ahead of schedule.
Yeah. Some of the panelists were coming.
So we're going to actually invite everyone to take a 10-minute break, and hopefully we will regroup at that point.
press.
Jerry. Patrick, how do you want people to line
I'll
up?
sit in whichever order you like. I mean, I guess we have one that's...
You want to sit here? Yeah. Can we, I think we're ready to start the second panel, so if we can ask everybody to come back into the room. Oh. Actually, hey, Mike, why don't you move down when I was actually standing in the wrong place? For those who weren't with us in the first session, wanted to remind everyone that that we are interactive, that the audience does have an opportunity to participate. And if you want to, on your phones, go to the website www.minty.com and use the code 136550. You will be able to ask questions during this presentation, and we will also have some polling questions for you to participate in and give us feedback on what you are thinking about the issues we'll be discussing. So with that, let me introduce again Patrick Tucker, who is going to moderate this panel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around for this panel, an important topic on challenges to the Middle East in the year 2030. And we're really going to be talking about a lot of different trends that are going on right now that are measurable and how they're going to interact with each other to change the environment of the Middle East. Security, certainly. That's in Washington, D.C., the one that, as a national security journalist, I spend a lot of my time with, but also demographics, energy, the environment, economics, of course. And so, as you've just heard, please send questions because we're going to put them up, and we're also going to be asking some questions of you to see whether or not our collective knowledge is kind of up to the task of addressing these challenges in the Middle East for the year 2030. So do send them in. And with that, I'm going to just sort of pop right in. You know everybody's bios because they're, they gave them to you when you walked in, and I'm going to turn to sort of get things started. A question for Ruba, our energy expert, and what do you see for the future of energy, both development and also the movement towards alternative energy in the Middle East in the next decade? And there's a microphone right there beside you.
Is this working?
Maybe better.
Maybe better use this one. Thank you, Patrick. Future of oil and gas. Well, as you know, the region has been dependent on oil and gas for a very long time, and I would say it's going to continue to be dependent on oil and gas for a very long time. Oil and gas in the region is first abundant, the availability of it, and then the cost. It's very cheap to produce, and as a result, it will continue to be the main generator of revenue for the governments. Not only that, but also if you look at the markets for Middle East oil and gas, demand growth. We talk a lot these days about demand growth slowing in Asia, which is the main market for Middle East oil. But we talk about slowing, and we're not saying that demand is stopping. So demand will continue to be important, and Asian markets, China and India, will continue to be the main users of Middle East oil and gas. The transition from conventional oil and gas to renewables has taken off a lot, I should say, but not equally in all the countries of the region. And that was driven essentially by the development in technology, the development of shale technology, for example. Sorry. You know, shale oil and shale gas has been both a curse and a blessing for the Middle East. It was a curse because shale oil came to compete with conventional oils from the region. But the developments in technology that have taken place, the development of shale gas, has been a blessing. Gas resources that were for a long time seen as uneconomic. For example, there is shale gas in the region. There was sour gas, tight gas, deep gas. These, which for a long time were not considered as, they not had a value by themselves, but were seen only as, gas was only seen as a byproduct of oil. Suddenly, with this technological development, gas is becoming important, and it's taking the value that it's supposed to have. And the future of gas in the region is going to be very important because of the availability, because of the technology, because of the cost that's going down, and because it is a clean energy. Even for the countries, for example, in the transition to renewables, we heard from the Minister of Abu Dhabi, and Abu Dhabi has been actually in the forefront in terms of the regional transition to renewables, followed by Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so one thing that I wanted to ask you there, because we just brought up Saudi Arabia and the oil sector there, we've all been watching last week this enormous event that happened with the Abak facility, knocking off, I think it was 5% of global oil production over the weekend, and now they say that they've been able to replace much of that, but it was 50% of their oil production. It was the largest thing that I've ever seen happen in the oil and gas market. So I wonder if you can tell us briefly, and then we'll talk about some of these other trends that might affect that. How has that event shaken the business as usual attitude in the Middle East oil and gas sector?
Yeah, well, two things. The attack on Abqaiq and Kharis highlighted two things about the business as usual in Saudi Arabia and in the region in general. One is the security issue. I mean, this attack was bound to happen. It happened. There were several attacks during the year on other oil and gas infrastructure, on pipelines, on the Shaiba oil field. And so it was, in my opinion, it was predictable. The issue that was raised by this attack was, is it preventable? Are there ways to prevent this kind of attack on infrastructure? And in the discussion that followed, lots of fingers were pointing at Iran, but whether it's Iran or whether it's the proxy actors of Iran, whether the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq at one point we talked about, or whether it's the Houthis and so on.
They're still pointing, by the way, those fingers.
They are still pointing, but the question is, what should be the response? I think that's what's being debated. And we hear, especially from here in the US, a lot of talk about that the answer should be military. What shall we target in Iran? Shall we target bases in Iran? And that's not an answer.
Yeah. So let me take that.
Let me just take just the second issue I was saying that has been highlighted by this attack is the dependency, the exactly thing I was talking about earlier, the dependency of the Saudi economy and the regional economies on oil and gas. When you have half of the production in Saudi Arabia knocked off, that means half of the revenues are being knocked off. That means industries are being, petrochemical industries, the gas industries are not going to run, going to normal. And here the big question is, that is going to be asked and will be asked is, to what extent are these countries going to remain dependent on oil and gas? And we can develop later.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Actually, so let me turn to you then, Fareed, because we're talking about the effects of an enormous attack on a huge portion of the economic activity in the Middle East, and particularly in Saudi Arabia. And from a World Bank perspective, when you look at the dominance that sector plays, when you look at growing concerns about insecurity, when you look at friction that seems to be accelerating between Saudi Arabia, Iran, Saudi Arabia's allies, and Iran. Today, Mike Pompeo had said that he wants to cobble together some sort of coalition. We don't know what that means yet, what that coalition means in terms of increasing tensions with Iran, but that's another sort of worrisome sign. And you look at the rising threat of terrorism on top of what's going to be a larger population in the Middle East, particularly of young people. What does the World Bank outlook look like for the region, and what can be done?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here with this distinguished panel. And let me say a couple of things. One is that we are all very good at diagnostics and saying, this is what happened, a year, 2 years, 3 months ago, and this is why it happened. And then it becomes a conversation that we can have. When it comes to the Arab Spring, everybody started talking about, if the failure of the social contract, the fact that there were some tensions that were all over the place and that people did not necessarily look at and address. And all this is good, and we have tons of, documents on that particular issue, including the population growth and including the job issue and including the fact that education is lagging in our part of the world and including the fact that the human capital is not looked at the way it should be looked at and surely not the way it is looked at in other places. The issue here, and this is why having a conversation with all of you guys is very important, ideas, new ideas. Do we have the possibility, all of us, to come up with, new concept for the region, something that would actually move the needle and stop just sitting there feeling very good at that, at our diagnostic and then go back home and have a beer or whatever and feel good about it. It's not what we should be doing. And this is where the World Bank comes in our interaction with all of you guys, with this institute and with other places, try to extract from our common knowledge and common experience something new to the region. If you look at the history of the region, every time there was a new idea, a new concept, that new idea shook the region and shaped it. That was true all through history. And last one was this whole conversation about political Islam and democracy. Now we are talking about other stuff. What can now move the region? For us, we have a number of avenues, a number of ways that we should really look at. One of them is, I mentioned it earlier, putting as much as we can on human capital, on education, on health, and social security, and putting it in a very active way and a novel way. It's not just putting money behind education, because the countries in this region are actually, devoting a large chunk of their budget on education. Look at the outcome. Look at the ranking of all of the universities of the region in any type of index around the world. It's dismal. It's terrible. Health is also an issue. It is obviously not equal in all places in the region, but possibly because of conflicts, etc. Health indicators are not that great. And poverty is rising in the region. The only region in the world where poverty is rising. Because of what? Because of, obviously, conflicts, etc. Mm-hmm. Now, what we are putting on the table is human capital. We need to put and create new ideas and create new ways of engaging. Second issue relates to, jumping on the bandwagon of new technology. I know that Paul has had some doubts about it, and we can have a conversation about it. But there is no other way. If the world is going the way it is going right now, and I always mention that when I just took this job, we went with the whole management team of MENA to Silicon Valley. It was for us to see what is that world thinking and how are they going about transforming the reality on the ground, and try to see whether we can bring that reality to the region. And the third point, and this is the most important one as of right now, is really to focus on boosting the private sector through competition, through contestability, through competitiveness, through creating more of a transparent way of going about economic activities. And this is important because it touches on governance. And I saw it earlier in your little, there were a number of issues that you put there. Stability of government, transparency, governance, rule of law. All these are fundamental to a vibrant and sustainable private sector, which we believe is the real driver of the economies of the region. As one last plea, this conversation for us is fundamental and important because we would like to get new ideas from you guys. So it's not just for us to answer. It's really for us to absorb whatever new ideas, new thinking you have, and that's going to be very important for us.
Okay, so I want to stick with something that you said just a moment ago, because you talked about what seems to be lacking in many ways is like a vision, and I've been watching like lots of great vision statements come out of the Middle East, the most important of which recently was the big MBS Saudi Arabia 2030 vision, which was this whole plan, very lauded here in Washington. People really love this. Finally, someone's going to diversify the economy and end corruption. How that is actually paying out with MBS's personality is a whole other issue, and we can talk about that separately, and certainly we do. But that as a vision statement, widely accepted in the West, people really liked it. This was supposed to be like the pathfinder plan for diversifying the economy, creating new industry, and as we know, Saudi Arabia also has pumped a lot of money into the development of new universities, very fancy looking. They pay a lot of money for Western educators to go over there and take up faculty positions. Is that, again, getting into like the behavior of the kingdom in a moment, but is that sort of thing an example, or is that sort of cosmetic?
Well, two things there. First of all, development is not instant coffee. They have a vision 2030. They launched it a couple of years ago. It cannot transform things overnight. But if you look today, and we'll get it in the coming few weeks, you look at the index on doing business for Saudi Arabia and a number of countries in the region, we will see in the coming weeks that a number of these countries have gone up dramatically because they have met a few triggers that really make a difference.
They've gone up in what?
On the ease of doing business.
On the ease of doing business.
Ease of doing business. This is the doing business index that the bank produces every year. So this is one. Second, it's not just Saudi Arabia. Algeria has Vision 2025. Tunisia has, everybody has a vision. It's great, but do we have visionaries? Do we have people who really are creating new ways of looking at the future? Yeah. I was talking to Paul earlier, and he tells me that you guys are now engaged in this kind of, looking at the future and try to extract something out of, the studies of these people who are, specialists in that. We would love to be engaged in that conversation because this is really what may make a difference above and beyond having a consulting firm coming and telling you, you have to change law ABC and regulation XYZ, and you'll do well. You will do slightly, marginally well, but this is not as ingrained and as grounded as it should be.
Okay, so with that, if you haven't answered the poll yet, too bad, because we're going to show the answer. And everybody knows the projected population in the year 2030, except for a handful of people who didn't use Google. But with that, this is part of what we're talking about, because this is a larger population than they have in the Middle East today. It's primarily young people. We've talked about some of these governance issues in terms of, a chronic problem that's perhaps getting better with corruption, a problem that seems to be getting better with ease of doing business. But we're also talking about, again, in light of a major attack on a huge sector of the Saudi Arabian economy. Michael, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the security trends that you see shaping the region. And we talked about it a bit yesterday, and your forecast is not good.
Yes, and unfortunately my mind hasn't changed since yesterday. I wish I could say it had. But before I begin, I just want to say thank you to Jerry, you, the other members of MEI who invited me to be here. For those of you that don't know, I only retired about a month and a half ago from the United States military. So I'm a bit of a stranger in a strange land today, sitting here in a business suit talking to this esteemed audience, but I hope I won't disappoint you. Let me start by just conveying what I suspect you will find is the overall tone of the brief remarks I'm going to make here in response to your question. The first is an old adage. Usually the best indicator of future performance is past performance. That's true for individuals. I believe it's true for populations and governments everywhere. In my own career, which spans the last about 20 years in either the Middle East or North Africa, a bit of time in South Asia. In my judgment, the scale and volume and amount of strategic danger that arises from either terrorism or insurgency has grown with every succeeding generation. That has been true my entire career. I see no reason why that will not be true in the future. And I think the way things are playing out, we are going to see continued growth in the kinds of politically motivated violence that tends to destabilize and unhinge the best laid plans of nation states and populations everywhere. Now, with that uplifting beginning, let me be a little more specific. I'm going to focus very briefly on three things that I think are responsive to your question. What challenges I see, what changes I see, and what improvements I see. I'm going to focus on the Middle East since that's what we're here to talk about, but everything I say is just as applicable to pretty much everywhere in North Africa, large chunks of Central Asia and South Asia as well. I believe the current conflicts, whether they be political or armed conflicts, for example, the GCC rift, the Gulf states versus Iran, Israel versus Iran, the regional strife against the Islamic State and what remains of Al-Qaeda across the Levant, Egypt's conflict with ISIS in Sinai, all of these things will endure. Most of these are getting worse, and I believe that trend will continue. Proxy struggles, which do overlap with the things I just talked about, among and between the various regional powers of the Middle East, will also continue. And unfortunately, I believe the Middle East and North Africa are particularly vulnerable to expansion of these proxy struggles because they're increasingly attractive for those who wish to achieve their strategic goals but have someone else shed their blood in order to achieve them.
What is the opportunity for future proxy struggle in North Africa?
There are, just as there are in the Middle East, there are non-state or tribal or militia-like actors in various places in North Africa that are accruing significant capability. That's something I'm going to talk about in a moment. But they are accruing significant capabilities, including very high technology capabilities that we normally have not associated with non-state actors. If you are one of the regional powers or even one of the non-regional but nonetheless important actors that have interests in North Africa, these are going to be increasingly attractive tools and instruments for them to use to achieve whatever goals they have in North Africa. We're seeing this right now in the Middle East. I predict we will see this soon in North Africa because it's utterly logical. If you can get someone with real capability to do your bidding, you're willing to pay the price as long as somebody else does the dying.
Excellent. So I want to return to that in a moment. As someone that's been watching ISIS and their movements in Libya, and also the collapse of a lot of the governance going on in Libya and the emergence of a warlord-like figure, General Haftar, in the east of the country, backed by Russia, which presents another sort of weird wrinkle in that question of like what is a proxy war in the Middle East, and as we look towards a future where that war does not necessarily limit itself to Middle East actors, that's also a discouraging trend that I think that we should touch on. But let me turn to you, Laila, for a second.
Can I finish? I hadn't quite finished. I want to be complete in my answer to you.
Sorry about that.
I'll be very brief. Yeah. The change that worries me the most is what I suspect everyone in this room knows very well: the continued erosion of confidence between populations of the Middle East and the governments that purport to govern them. You can have a heck of an argument about when that erosion began, but that erosion is very vivid, and that deterioration continues to this day. And that has enormous strategic consequences, not just for the people of the Middle East, but everyone who has an interest in the Middle East. So for some, it is a terrible problem. For others, it is an enormous opportunity to use that to exploit that loss of confidence. The last thing is an improvement, although in keeping with everything I've just said right now, up till now, which is pretty negative, it is to a degree a malign improvement. But I've already mentioned it. The constantly rising, extraordinary availability of increasingly high technology systems, capabilities, platforms, communications, and weaponry. What just happened in Saudi Arabia a few days ago, for me, the question of who did it is beside the point. There is the fact that an actor like the Houthis could have done this. Whether or not they did it is, to me, irrelevant. They could have done it. They've been well on the road to doing this. They are a non-state, non-governmental actor. That is a signpost of things to come. And with that uplifting closing, I'll stop.
Okay. Yes, it actually really is remarkable the way that this swarm attack happened. Saudi Arabia has a Patriot missile system, and they have active radar, and they're actually able to capture things like fighter jets on that radar. These swarms were flying in so close to the infrastructure, to the ground, that there's too much noise. The radar can't pick them up. And of course, Patriot missiles are a very bad solution for a swarm of drones that are about the size of this table. So there really is a solutions gap that emerging technology is creating in terms of security. So I wanted to turn to you, Laila, and ask a little bit about how all of these trends that we're talking about are going to affect environmental factors in the Middle East in the next decade, and how is the Middle East positioned for climate change?
Well, after this doom and gloom, let me be the one that brings you glad tidings of great joy.
Thank you.
After two uprisings, 2011, 2013, it took the country a while to get on its feet. But one of the first things that the Ministry of Electricity did was announce a feed-in tariff. That was the signal to the market. It took a while until things got sorted out, but the government played simply an enabling role, leaving the multilateral banks and the investors to do the development and implementation of what is now, so far, the largest solar park in Ben, Aswan, 1.8 gigawatts. Of course, the presentation by His Excellency, the Minister, shows that they're going to outdo us, but it's okay. So we're on the road to providing 20% of our energy needs through renewables by 2020. That did include a lot of employment generation, albeit temporary. However, It has spun off a lot of startups, and I'd like to also bring you some good news about what young people are doing in the IT sector. They have partnered with the government to establish the first e-wallet payment in the country. It started with the widows. They are spread all over the country. The government wanted them to disperse easily. How do we do it? Everybody has a cell phone, but not a smartphone. And so they developed an e-wallet system that bypasses the banking system, and there's money circulating in the poverty sector. Now, I'd like to also say, if I had to choose a game changer in my country, and I think region, I would not bank as much on the formal private sector. I would bank on the informal private sector. In all of the data we present, none of us actually really know exactly how many jobs are created. But we in Egypt know that during the two uprisings, the only reason we did not completely starve and stop moving and living is because the informal sector was alive and thriving. The 400,000 young entrants into the labor market will not make it into the formal private sector either because of access or poor skill match, whatever. But they will find, okay, they're not the decent jobs, but they will find jobs in the informal sector. So the economy, the SMEs, are now the conversation that the government is holding about how to integrate them. It's a very complicated one because there's a group that says, let's integrate them and formalize them, to tax them, to count them, to calculate how much they contribute to GDP. Others are saying, no, you have to facilitate and enable and give them grace periods and support. And now this informal sector is being upgraded in different ways, and we're not sure which model works best yet. So we have clusters of people. I've been working with the garbage collectors of Cairo for 35 years, and I can tell you that they, on their own, have developed a waste management system that takes care of the materials. It's a chain of custody that generates 7 jobs for every ton of material. They don't call it waste. In the collection part only. How many SMEs in the recycling, recovery, sorting, compacting, granulating? Millions. They're dispersed and they're uncounted. And they contribute to the cleanliness of a mega city, one of the largest, in the world. So are they counted? Do they appear in the official documents of the Ministry of Environment? No. When I was minister, they said Egypt recovers 3%. I was horrified. I said, guys, I know how much these people recover. So it's not just them. There's all sorts of clusters of informal sector, SMEs, and businesses and job creation areas in our regions that are actually what will make us survive all of these stories.
Okay. Well, that's actually a very good turn, and unexpectedly. So let me, Jerry, turn to you with this audience question. What is an emergent political trend we are overlooking from MENA as social contracts shift and traditional pillars of power change by demographic and historical experience? Your thoughts on this?
Well, it's a good question. And it goes back. I mean, in other words, what do we see as the political change that's coming? And I wanted to pick up because we had Dick Clark, who opened this conversation this morning, making the point that that the technology changes that are occurring can drive the world and the region in one of two directions. It can either be a direction of positive change, or it can be a direction of negative change. And I think that Mike, kind of laid out the case for the negative change that could be coming. I think from Layla, but also from Fareed, some thought about what are the positive opportunities that might be developed. And so when you look at, what is the kind of the gray swan, if you will, of political change in the region that's going to drive us one way or the other, what I would say is that the engagement of young people that we saw initially in 2011, and that even though many people talk about the death of the Arab Spring or the end of the Arab Spring, The fact of the matter is that, in my view, the Arab Spring may be dormant, but it will be coming back. And that I think that, as we look to the future and as we think about how we can help move the arc, if you will, towards the positive outcome that we would all like to see, I think that the things that Fareed talked about in terms of investment in human capital, engagement, what can the United States do? What should be the role of the United States in trying to push things in that direction, both in the public sphere as well as in the private sphere. And I do think that U.S. business has an important role to play on encouraging investment in young people and creating the jobs that will take people away from this trend towards extremism, that will dry up the pool of potential proxies in these conflicts, and move things in that positive direction. So I think that this is really what we should be focusing our energy on, what we should be focusing our attention on, is how do we take advantage of these trends? How do we bring young people into the conversation in ways that we can address climate change, that we can address the employment gap, and do all of these other things, and hopefully then produce a more positive outcome.
So again, if you have access to the internet, please feel free to participate in this poll, because it's directly related to what Jerry is just talking about in terms of the unemployment rate among young people in the Middle East. And as I recall from the Arab Spring, one of the trends that I was watching that was a corollary to what was happening was the sudden explosion in inflation in the price of food was roughly correlated with a lot of the civic insecurity that was happening at the same time. And fortunately, in a lot of countries, that civil friction played out in a way that resulted in peaceful pro-democratic transitions in power. That's really amazing. In Syria, it sort of ground to a halt in a civil war. But I wonder, Fareed, if you could talk a little bit about this question specifically of unemployment of young people and what that bodes for future prospects, and also, is there a policy solution that Washington should be talking about to that?
Yeah, that doesn't bode very well, obviously. Let me make a couple of points. You just mentioned something that I believe was really at the center of a number of the dynamics happening. The issue of the environment and the in Syria, after a couple of years of drought and people starting to move from the rural areas to the urban areas, etc., that created a lot of tension. That created obviously shortages, basic services and food, etc., and that led to the beginning of an explosion. That is where we are right now. And obviously, this is a shortcut, but we need to take into consideration the fact that climate change is really playing a very, very important and deep role in the stability of the world in general and in the region, and it's been proven. Mm-hmm. So this is one. Second, when it comes to the issue of youth and unemployment, by current trend, our projections are that by 2050, we'll be looking at more than 300 million young people seeking jobs. In a job market that we don't know right now, and we don't know what that job market would be looking at. We don't know, what kind of skills, that job market will be in need of. And the issue right now is that our education sector is so poor and poorly managed that, if we cannot right now bring people to a place where they can, understand what they are reading, how can you imagine they will be able to actually look at those high-tech new jobs coming down the stretch? I'll give you one number, one statistic. Today, close to 60 to 65% of the young people in MENA between the age of 10 actually cannot comprehend, understand, what they are possibly reading. 65%. In a place, including, for instance, Tunisia, or Jordan, these places were, years back, doing pretty okay in terms of education. Their education system has fallen flat. So this is really where we should put our energy, and this is really what we should be pushing. Let me make a last point here, because you mentioned the fact that there is an erosion of connection between government and the citizens. Look at what happened 2 days ago in Tunisia. We have today the second round of elections, presidential election, with two people. One of them is an Arab nationalist, slash flirting with Islamists. The other one is, he has not yet been condemned to anything, but by all accounts, he's a crook. So this is what you have as a choice.
Likely
so
crook.
when on the 6th of October or whenever the election is going to be, the second round will be decided, I, as a citizen, will have to go and vote. Who the hell would I vote for? And it is an issue today. Yeah. It is a huge issue. And this is really the outcome of 20, 25 years of bad government, bad governance, and frankly, a lot of corruption around. The possible responsible for that, has died just today. Ben Ali has died today. And it may very well be that, history will see him as the person who actually took a country that was okay, generally speaking, to a country where today the social contract was broken into 1,000 pieces. And this is where we need to be looking at. And when you talked about what Washington should be doing, not just in Tunisia, but throughout the region, is really push the agenda of openness, democracy, contestability in businesses, and make sure that whatever aid or whatever support goes specifically for that agenda, and not for other agendas that are more of a social agenda that are not necessarily as important and frankly as pivotal to the future of the region.
So there's the answer to the poll was 30%. Again, everybody understands and how to use Google, which is amazing. But Michael, let me turn to you, and also with the statistic, 30% of the unemployment rate among people that are age 15 to 24. You've spent a lot of time looking not just at these big security issues from the perspective of the United States, but also understanding drivers of extremism, particularly in the Middle East. And in terms of what you've just heard, are we understanding the drivers of extremism well enough now to begin to craft policy that might mitigate it?
That is a great question. Unfortunately, my answer is a resounding no.
Okay.
We have several obstacles that both countries in the region, as well as pretty much every nation, including my own, that struggles against some form of violent extremism, have yet to surmount. The first one may come as a bit of a surprise to everybody. It is the paucity of actual research in what causes someone to become a terrorist. There is no shortage of publications, books, articles, what have you, that purport themselves to be empirical research about why people become terrorists or violent extremists. And some of it is quite real, empirically driven, peer-reviewed, repeated experiment, repeated study, research. Much of it is not. Much of it is personal opinion and anecdote that it has been cosmetically altered to appear as if it is research. And when one considers how massive the scale of terrorism is today, for the Americans in the room, I don't know how many of you recognize this, but I've had to grapple with this my entire career. For the United States, the counterterrorism clock began on 9/11, which is a completely arbitrary number when one considers how long other countries and other peoples have been struggling against this. But even if you just use that arbitrary mark on the calendar of 9/11, America now confronts more terrorists today than it did on 9/11. And that is not what we were going for. But the reasons are things we only partially understand. So that's one obstacle we have yet to surmount. The other obstacle I think worth mentioning here is when, in my previous job, which was as arguably the senior counterterrorism strategist for the United States government for the last 3 years, when one examines, or at least when I examined, how governments everywhere, including my own, apportion resources, manpower, and policy support for the various methods by which someone can contest terrorism or prevent it from being created, I doubt it will surprise anyone in this room that by orders of magnitude, the vast preponderance of monies spent around the world on contesting terrorism are spent on either law enforcement, intelligence, or military actions, usually that involve the use of physical force against terrorists. A very tiny fraction of what the world spends on counterterrorism goes to things like preventing radicalization, contesting terrorist narratives either in the public domain or on the internet, preventing terrorists travel, denying them their resources. The things I've just listed generally do not involve the use of force. Matter of fact, the use of force is antithetical to accomplishing these kinds of approaches against terrorism. But this enormous imbalance between how the world spends its treasure on dealing with terrorism, the use of physical force, versus all the ways in which you do not have to use physical force, that imbalance is why, despite our best efforts, the scale and scope of terrorism around the world, and sadly including the Middle East, continues to grow.
So this is not hugely surprising, and yet it is a little bit surprising because the United States has made, sort of recently, I think beginning in 2015, there stood up the State Department, a Global Engagement Center, which had the charge at the time of basically countering ISIS narratives, and it got more money to help counter disinformation narratives, mostly coming from Russia. But the point of it was very much geared towards basically fighting jihadism online in a way that the State Department wasn't doing effectively then. And though it's a small bit of money compared to the U.S. military budget or U.S. counterterrorism budget appropriated to military solutions, it's still money. So are there any places, particularly in the United States, because we are in Washington, where Washington is getting it right? Is that one of them?
There are people trying to get it right, but I think it would be a terrible misapprehension to believe we have gotten it right. I'll use the Global Engagement Center as my example. I'm a huge fan of the Global Engagement Center. I used to, in my past position, I used to co-chair a regular forum with them where we focused specifically on terrorist-related counter-messaging, because as hopefully you know and most people know, its mandate was expanded by Congress a couple of years ago to include all forms of messaging activities by the United States government for national security purposes, whether or not it had anything to do with terrorism. But for those of you that don't know, this is the second instantiation of this organization. It was originally created as the CSCC right after Mosul fell, and it was specifically focused on messaging against the Islamic State. Wish I could remember what CSCC stood for, but I don't. And here, unfortunately, this is a matter of public record, so I'm not talking about anything classified here. It was formed to be the national platform for the United States for contesting what was an extraordinarily powerful narrative coming out of the Islamic State. Well, it never got a budget, and it never was assigned any people.
Right.
So the poor director literally had to walk around this town pleading for money and asking to borrow people. Yeah. There's an old saw in Washington, D.C. I suspect it's true of every national capital. There are only two things that matter in this town: people and money. If you get neither, then you don't matter.
Yeah.
Now, it's much better than that now. It has a budget now. It's actually able to hire people now. That's a good thing. But if you look at these since 2014, so it's been 5 years of its existence, only in the last year has it gotten the two things that make it matter. So it has a long way to go.
I remember this. I remember that there were like 10 people from the Pentagon that were working at it at the time, and there was Michael Lumpkin, who was the former Undersecretary of Defense for low-intensity conflict, was like, I need more people.
They were loaned with no expectation of being replaced when their tenure was over.
So in theory, we're getting better, but the question is, are we getting better quick enough? You had a question, Ruben. Yeah. Yes.
If I may, I have a question to Michael, actually. To what extent do you think have there been assessment in the U.S. of what role the U.S. policy, whether it's engagement or disengagement in the region, has led, if not led to, at least encouraged the emergence of the what we call terrorist organizations or the non-state actors that are planting havoc in the region?
That is a wonderful question, and I can only give you a partial answer. For me, I'll try to respond in two different ways. First of all, as I think everyone here knows, there is still a debate raging in this town about to what degree do we care about what happens in the Middle East. There are some people who will publicly say, we've had enough of this. It's time to attend to our own backyard. The people of the region need to sort their own troubles out. There are others who would argue, I like to count myself among them, who think we have enormous economic, political, security, and frankly, humanitarian interests in the Middle East, and it would be a terrible tragedy and a terrible strategic mistake to walk away from the region. But that is an unfinished, incomplete argument. I do not know how it's going to end. The second way is, even if we decide to engage, that engagement is in the interest of the United States, what form should it take? As I suspect everyone here knows, certainly everyone who lives in the Middle East knows, the vast preponderance of our interest has been security related, primarily to buttress the free flow of oil. There are some who would argue we should just perpetuate that. We need to return to that, we need to bolster it, but we need to continue it because it's been enormously successful. I am not in that camp because I keep confronting more terrorists every year than there were last year. So my personal opinion is that we should stay engaged in the Middle East, we should stay strongly engaged, but we have to change our approach.
I want to remind everybody to please send in questions to the Menti thing. And first, we're going to take a look at the answer to this poll. I imagine, here we go. Yes, this is the one that everybody missed. It's a very small percentage of the digital economy that accounts for GDP in the Middle East. So this aligns with a lot that we're talking about here today, because the digital economy is, of course, the driver of the United States' global competitiveness now. We became an information economy, and we outsourced a lot of our manufacturing to other parts of the world, and then they became information economies too, and now we compete in that way, and that's the driver of growth. So let me turn to you, Fareed. When you look at the inevitability, and I want to turn this into a hopeful thing. When you look at the inevitability of that percentage rising, because it will, that's the way technology works, it's the way information technology works. It does spread democratically, and then it creates huge economic potential. It creates exactly those startups that Lila was talking about a moment ago, and life does get better. It's when your percentage of the digital economy is like really high and saturated, that's when you're beginning to have tech bubbles and people start to sell. But at this level, what this says to me is there's a ton of potential growth, right? There's just a ton of potential there. When do you feel like this number gets better, and what effect does that have?
Well, obviously it will have a huge effect. Now, when you go from Morocco all the way to Iraq, actually, and I visited all of the countries in between, including those two, you go and see young people, young and less young people, basically engaging in a totally new way of developing business. Startups are really becoming, a household kind of name and activity. It's in all places. I was in Baghdad not very long ago. It's really amazing to see how many entrepreneurs are actually relying on new technology, are pushing the boundaries, and are showing extreme creativity. Take to the other side, Morocco, incredible. I was to this Casablanca place where incredible new ideas are put on the table, and people are making money out of these. The issue now, and when Algeria, same thing. So when you ask, okay, what can the bank do to help? One thing, get the government off our back. That's basically what they're asking. And what they're asking is true, because if you look around, the regulatory framework that is supposed to be, framing these new activities is a framework that is basically framing the old activity, the activity of the 20th century. So we need new ways of going about this business and new ways of opening more possibility and doors to these young people. When we talk about contestability, it has a lot to do with the way, for instance, the banking sector works. We need to get into a place where e-payments become the normal business of everybody. We need to come to a place where, for instance, a country like Tunisia that prides itself of being on the edge of many things, PayPal is not there. The central bank is still very conservative, and it's true in many other countries. So we need really to push that agenda in order to unleash the potential of these young people who have the capacity, to work not only in their country, but they can also engage in other markets. If you look at places like between Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco, where politically things are not always very smooth and very fluid, well, these young people, from Algiers and from Casablanca, they are out exchanging, and they are selling services and goods to each other. And this going around some of the regulations of their own governments. So there is, for us as a bank, a real strong urge to move ahead with these governments and try to work the whole direction towards, either deregulation or clever and agile regulation, so that these industry can actually grow.
That's fascinating, because it's very counterintuitive to what you just said, where we were talking about weak governance structures and the problems that presents. And at the same time, there's weak governance structures, but there's also huge regulatory burden and enforcement, which gets in the way of entrepreneurship, which is very counterintuitive to me, because you don't imagine those things being in conflict. How good do you think the World Bank is right now? How effective are they being in helping these governments to understand and identify where they're creating regulatory burdens? Is that being accepted, or are you meeting with stubbornness because you're encroaching on incumbent territory?
Well, yes, we are yes. Obviously encroaching into incumbent territory. It is a big deal there. Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, these kind of things are not, unfortunately, instant coffee. They don't happen overnight, but because of this technology, because of the speed of this technology, and because of the huge potential, we need to increase our engagement with these governments. Persuade them that too much or too many regulations actually is going to be killing this kind of industry. Take again another example that is now is seen as the panacea. Startup Act. In Tunisia, they have adopted the Startup Act about a year ago. They made a big deal out of it. In fact, that Startup Act is actually stifling innovation, because it actually engages or instills government, the administration, bureaucracy, into an industry that is supposed to be an industry that is free, that is open, that moves fast, that is young and agile. Mm-hmm. And this is the tension that we need to make sure we address. And as I mentioned, going back to what those Algerian entrepreneurs told me, get the government off of our back. And that's what we are trying to do through our dialogue with these governments.
He sounds like you could be in a congressional ad for somebody running out of Tennessee. Leila and Ruba, I want to turn to you for a second, because as we talk about future engines of economic growth, there's a question from the audience. MENA countries, especially the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, are the most pollutant per capita in the world. Are countries doing anything about it, considering climate change awareness in the region is dismal? So I wonder if you might both talk about that sense of where the populace is on environmental factors, and are they does that have any friction with, of course, the economic drivers of growth in the region being oil and gas? I'll turn to you, Ruba, first.
I talked earlier about the renewable energies, or let's say decarbonization of the production of energy in the Middle East. It's starting to take force, especially in the UAE, but more particularly Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia, and it's expanding to other countries. Of course, the population is increasing, mm-hmm. and as a result, the economy has to grow. And growth in economy means increase in demand on energy. And this is where the governments have to respond. In terms of to answer the question in renewable energy, one of the things that, again, the minister earlier showed us slides where solar power is taking, it's expanding very quickly. One, because sun is available in those regions. In certain areas, even wind is being, like offshore Oman, they are starting with the first offshore wind farm, and they are looking at onshore wind. What has encouraged this is that the cost of building solar power generation has gone down a lot. Now, but there is another problem that those countries are facing. I said, because of their dependence on oil to generate revenue, they need to invest in oil, invest in their oil production in order to increase their revenues. And increase of revenues, they have to use it in renewables, but then you have competition for revenues to invest them in renewables or to invest them again in oil in order to complete this cycle.
Yeah. Laila, because you also were talking a little bit earlier about all of this great innovation that's happening out of Egypt and in the alternative energy sector, but do you feel like there is a political consensus in the Middle East, particularly among young people, about climate change and also about the level of pollution that affects the region?
Young people are becoming very savvy and very politically aware. There are all these community-based efforts, and now with the Education Reform Project, where 2,000 servers have gone up in 2,000 of the 40,000 schools, and critical thinking is our formula to fight extremism. Yet, young people in the Middle East know, in Egypt, that they are not the ones who cause climate change. So while we bemoan what's happening to our farmers, our coastal zones, the salinity of the soil, water shortage, etc., they know that whatever they do, it's just a stopgap measure, that the real elephant in the room is the United States and a handful of other countries who are generating the greenhouse gases. So they know that whatever they do, mitigation, adaptation, it's not going to solve the problem. And so for us all, I think we need to seriously look at the root cause of the problem, because development assistance is not going to make it. There's no amount of development assistance that will adapt, mitigate, and change what is coming to us from a place where we did not create it.
That's very discouraging. But let me turn to another audience question here. I'm going to ask it of each of you, and let's go quickly so we can try and move in as many audience questions as we can before we close. So briefly, the question is, let's pretend it's 2050 and the Middle East is a stable, prosperous, and well-governed place. How did it get there? That's a broader question, but I think this one helps create brevity. What was the key decision or decisions that were made, and who made them? I'll start with you, Jerry. 2050, the Middle East is fixed. Who made the decision and what was the decision?
I would say that if you're going to pick out one issue and one change that could influence the development going forward, I would say addressing the issue of governance, the role of citizens and the relationship of citizens to the state, is going to be the most important factor. I think if you want to change the kind of trajectories that we've been talking about here, that the best way to do that is to give citizens, and particularly young people who are going to be the citizens of the future, to give them a greater stake in their societies and to address their political, social, and economic requirements in order to ensure that they have successful lives.
Who does that? Is that heads of state? Is that?
Well, I think that everybody has a role in that. I think that the United States has a role in that in terms of what we can do to try to impart our values and to try to help these societies build institutions. When you look at the failures of the last 10 years, an awful lot of it is the failure of institutions to be able to address and to provide an adequate framework for development of societies. So I think that the United States has a role in helping to develop those institutions. I think that World Bank, IMF, the rest of the international community, and those societies themselves have to all play a role in building up institutional capacity to provide health, education, private sector, to develop a framework that is encouraging private investment, to do all of those things. All of us can play a role in doing that.
Okay, so help governance, build institutions, and who does it is everybody. Michael.
Well, at the risk of sounding trite, I think I can sum up my answer in that one of the oldest beliefs in mankind is that countries, societies, populations will generally go and they will generally do what their leaders convince them they should do. The current generation of leaders we have in 2019 will not get us to the place you are talking about. They are not getting us to the place you are talking about. So the next generation, because the timeline you described is another generation from now. If we do not cultivate, if people like me are not cultivating the 20-year-olds that are entering government or leadership service, it can be civil society leadership, it can be industry leadership. If we're not cultivating leaders that are asking this question, where do we want to be a generation from now, as opposed to where do we want to be when my political tenure is over, or where do I want to be when my military command expires? If we're not cultivating those kinds of leaders who are focused on the far horizon, we will not get there.
Excellent. Laila.
As I said, we are seeing young people do things and become more aware and knowledgeable. But I just would like to say that we should pay more attention to the inequality aspect of whatever it is. It may be caused by climate change or poor economic policies. My hunch is that if we work with people in our region on addressing inequalities, then we can create leaders and take our countries to where we need to go, whether it's on climate, on poverty, on education, wherever.
Okay, excellent. Ruba.
Well, two things. One would be, in order for the Middle East to be a prosperous region and so on, the way we're talking about 2050, it has to become an integrated region. The way we look at the EU, for example. And that means that there has to be a change at the level of, I think what was Michael who talked about, the way the population sees their governments, the rulers, the relationship between governor and governed. And I linked this to the US, and maybe one aspect of this is that despite what you said about the US has interest in the region and so on, but the US has not been helping in the relationship between governed and governed and governor. I mean, it's. I'm not saying a secret. Obviously, the U.S. has been standing with every single despot that strangled his population in the region. So maybe one needs to
not every single one.
Almost. Okay. Let me add a qualifier. We almost. Some, yes. Yeah, I cannot think of one who is not over 30 years. I can't think of a ruler who was not a despot in the region.
Ayatollah. We don't do. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
Now I lost my line of thinking.
Integration, everybody.
Yeah, I mean, but because my point here is that sometimes the interest, you talked about the interests of the US, sometimes it's conflicts with the interests of the people of the region. It's not necessarily, they don't necessarily correlate. So,
yeah. Okay, Reed.
Okay, very briefly, I think it's education. Mm-hmm. If we agree that the youth of the region are going to be the determining factor of its future, which is obviously a fact, well, I mean, educating these young people and making them realize through this new way of educating them that the only way forward is the 21st century, and they stop looking behind, stop being nostalgic. I'm looking at your question there, mm-hmm. and realize that at the end of the day, the world is going very, very fast, and that the region is really lagging behind. So once again, it's education, education, education.
Is that NGOs? Is that heads of state? Is
No,
it
it's the whole NGO conversation is a long one, and I'm not sure it's relevant right now. But no, the policies of the government should be geared towards educating their young people, putting not only the money, but opening the sphere of activity so that people can actually think freely and engaging in upgrading the curricula. We should not today in MENA have young people still nostalgic of what happened 1,400 years ago. We are not there any longer. We need to be looking forward, because 1,400 years ago, those people were looking forward, and actually the whole civilization of Islamic and Arab civilization thrived because they were looking forward and not behind them. We need to make sure that we are looking forward and not, to the ancestors that had the good, bad, and ugly among them.
Okay. And with that, I'm afraid we're out of time. So please join me in thanking our panel for this great discussion today.
Thank you. Well managed. Yeah.